Introduction. Facing trauma. You do not need to step onto a distant battlefield or walk through the dusty remnants of a refugee camp to come face to face with the shattering reality of trauma. It is not a phenomenon reserved for the edges of the civilized world. Rather, it is woven into the very fabric of our everyday lives. It touches us, our closest friends, our extended families, and the people we pass on the street. When we look at the sobering statistics provided by public health organizations, the scale of hidden suffering becomes undeniable. A staggering number of individuals, 1 out of every 5, endured sexual molestation during their formative years. A quarter of the population bears the physical or emotional scars of severe parental beatings, while a similar fraction grew up navigating the chaotic unpredictability of a home overshadowed by familial alcoholism. The shadow of domestic violence looms equally large, with a third of couples experiencing physical aggression and countless children forced to watch their mothers suffer at the hands of those who are supposed to protect them. Humanity, by its very nature, is a species defined by profound resilience. We have spent millennia surviving catastrophic conflicts, enduring devastating natural disasters, and navigating the quiet, agonizing betrayals that take place within our own homes. Yet, surviving is not the same as emerging unscathed. Extreme experiences carve deep, enduring pathways. On a macro level, they sculpt the histories and cultures of entire nations. On a micro level, they seep into the roots of family trees, passing unmentionable secrets and silent anguish down through successive generations. These invisible wounds reshape our emotional landscapes, altering our capacity to experience joy, to trust others, and to forge genuine intimacy. Even our biological systems, our immune responses and cellular functions, are altered by the heavy burden of psychological injury. The ripple effects of such devastation are never confined solely to the individual who endured the initial shock. A soldier returning from the horrors of combat may bring the war into his living room, terrifying his spouse and children with sudden outbursts of rage or withdrawing behind an impenetrable wall of emotional numbness. The partners of those grappling with severe post-traumatic stress frequently sink into profound depression, and children raised by depressed or checked-out parents face an elevated risk of developing deep-seated anxieties and insecure attachments. A childhood steeped in domestic violence often acts as a barrier in adulthood, severely hindering the ability to build stable, trusting relationships. At its core, a traumatic event is an experience that defies the mind's ability to process and integrate it. It is fundamentally intolerable. Those who survive sexual assault, warfare, or childhood abuse often find the memory so overwhelmingly agonizing that they instinctively attempt to banish it from their consciousness. They strive to compartmentalize the horror, putting on a brave face and attempting to march forward as though the event never occurred. Yet it requires a monumental expenditure of mental and physical energy to maintain the facade of normalcy while secretly carrying the immense weight of terror, vulnerability, and profound shame. Despite our desperate conscious desire to leave the past behind, the primitive regions of our brain, the ancient structures dedicated solely to detecting threat and ensuring our survival, are entirely incapable of denial. Long after the external danger has vanished, these lower brain centers remain on high alert. The slightest trigger, a fleeting reminder of the original threat, can reactivate dormant alarm circuits, flooding the body with a massive surge of stress hormones. This sudden physiological cascade thrusts the individual into a state of intense physical distress and chaotic emotion, often prompting impulsive or aggressive reactions that seem entirely disproportionate to the present moment. For the survivor, these overwhelming post-traumatic responses feel bizarre and terrifyingly out of control, leading many to the tragic conclusion that they are permanently broken, damaged at their very core, and beyond any hope of healing. The seeds of a lifelong quest to understand this complex interplay of mind and body were planted during a summer camp many years ago. It was there, through the enthusiastic explanations of a relative, that the miraculous intricacies of human biology first captured a young mind. The realization of how the body's systems flawlessly regulate and heal themselves left an indelible mark. Later, throughout rigorous medical training across various disciplines, it became increasingly apparent that the foundation of all healing lies in a deep comprehension of the organism's inner workings. Yet, upon entering the field of psychiatry, a stark and troubling contrast emerged. While the complexity of the human mind and our profound need for interpersonal medical establishment possessed shockingly little knowledge regarding the true origins of the psychological suffering it sought to treat. The burning question became whether we might one day map the intricate terrain of brains, minds, and human love with the same precision we apply to the cardiovascular or respiratory systems. While a complete and flawless understanding may still lie in the future, the convergence of three pioneering scientific disciplines has revolutionized our grasp of psychological trauma, abuse, and profound neglect. The advent of neuroscience has allowed us to observe how the brain orchestrates mental processes. The rise of developmental psychopathology has illuminated how early adverse experiences warp the unfolding architecture of the mind and brain. Concurrently, interpersonal neurobiology has begun to chart the profound ways in which our behavior and emotional states physically influence the neurobiology of the people around us. Through the lens of these emerging sciences, it has become unequivocally clear that severe trauma is not merely an abstract psychological concept. It instigates concrete, measurable, physiological transformations. It recalibrates the brain's internal threat detection system, chronically elevates stress hormone production, and distorts the neural filters that distinguish relevant information from meaningless background noise. Crucially, overwhelming experiences compromise the specific regions of the brain responsible for conveying the visceral, embodied sensation of being present and alive. These structural and chemical alterations explain why those carrying the weight of unhealed trauma remain perpetually vigilant to unseen threats, unable to relax into the spontaneous flow of daily life. It clarifies why survivors so often find themselves ensnared in repetitive cycles of suffering, seemingly unable to absorb new lessons from their current experiences. Their struggles are not born from a lack of moral fortitude, weak character, or diminished willpower. They are the direct manifestations of an altered neural landscape. Fortunately, this explosion of knowledge regarding the underlying mechanics of trauma has simultaneously unlocked unprecedented avenues for healing. By understanding the brain's inherent neuroplasticity, its remarkable ability to change and rewire itself, we can develop targeted approaches to not only soothe the symptoms but actively reverse the physiological damage. The journey toward recovery generally follows three fundamental pathways. The first is a top-down approach, utilizing dialogue and interpersonal connection to process memories and consciously understand our internal experiences. The second pathway involves pharmacological or technological interventions designed to quiet the hyperactive alarm systems and alter how the brain organizes incoming data. The third is a bottom-up approach, focusing on the body itself. This involves engaging in physical experiences that directly and viscerally contradict the paralyzing helplessness, furious rage, or systemic collapse that trauma installs in the nervous system. The optimal path to healing is highly individualized, and empirical observation suggests that true recovery most often requires a thoughtful synthesis of these different modalities. The dedication to this multifaceted approach to healing has been the driving force behind decades of clinical practice and research. Collaborative efforts with dedicated colleagues have facilitated the treatment of countless individuals, from those scarred by childhood abuse and domestic violence to survivors of war, natural disasters, and systemic human trafficking. A commitment to rigorous observation and continuous reassessment has allowed for a deep understanding of which therapeutic interventions resonate most effectively with different forms of suffering. While the primary objective has always been the direct care and restoration of the individuals seeking help, this clinical work has been inextricably linked to a broader mission of scientific inquiry. Supported by various institutions, extensive research has been conducted to measure the efficacy of a wide spectrum of treatments. From traditional psychotherapy and pharmacology to innovative practices involving mindful movement, desensitization techniques, neurofeedback, and even the communal rhythm of theater, every avenue has been explored with a singular goal in mind. The ultimate challenge remains: how can individuals burdened by the agonizing residues of their past regain mastery over their own nervous systems? How can they reclaim the captaincy of their own lives? While insight, human connection, and medication all play vital roles, true transformation often requires engaging the physical body to dismantle the ingrained physical imprints of terror and defeat. There is no single, universal cure, but rather a spectrum of profound therapeutic possibilities. What follows is an invitation to confront the stark realities of psychological injury without looking away. a guide to understanding the profound ways in which our experiences shape our biology, and a call to action for both individuals and society to embrace the comprehensive, embodied approaches necessary to truly heal the enduring wounds of trauma. Chapter 1. Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. The aftermath of a holiday weekend in the late 1970s brought the harsh realities of wartime trauma directly into a small clinic office at the Boston Veterans Administration. A towering, disheveled former Marine stormed into the room, reeking of alcohol and radiating a frantic, desperate energy. This was Tom, a man whose life had been fractured a decade earlier in the jungles of Southeast Asia. For Tom, the 4th of July was not a celebration of independence. The explosive sounds of fireworks, the oppressive heat, and the dense foliage of summer served only as agonizing reminders of an ambush that had decimated his platoon. Terrified of his own explosive rage, he isolated himself from his wife and 2 young sons, self-medicating with alcohol and seeking the dangerous thrill of high-speed motorcycle rides just to outrun his inner demons. Tom's nights offered no sanctuary. Sleep was a battlefield where he was continually ambushed, haunted by the visceral memories of dead soldiers and lifeless children. He would stay awake drinking to avoid the terrors of the night, leaving his family to tiptoe around his unconscious body the next morning. On paper, Tom was a paragon of American success, a high school valedictorian who had followed his father's World War II footsteps into the military, served honorably as a platoon leader, and returned to build a thriving legal practice and a picturesque family. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed veneer of normalcy, he felt entirely hollow. The letters from his high school sweetheart had sustained him in the combat zone, but back in the safety of civilian life, he found himself utterly incapable of feeling genuine affection for her or their children. This paradoxical existence, outwardly functional but inwardly devastated, resonated with deep, personal echoes. Growing up in the shadows of post-war Europe, the legacy of conflict had been a silent yet palpable presence in the household. A father, once imprisoned for his resistance against an occupying regime, oscillated between quiet, devout mornings and sudden, terrifying outbursts of temper. An uncle, a survivor of a brutal labor camp in the Pacific Theater, bore the same volatile scars. Even a mother's unspoken childhood suffering occasionally breached the surface in bewildering episodes of fainting and blame. Listening to Tom, it became clear that the nightmares, the emotional detachment, and the uncontrollable anger were not isolated anomalies. They were the universal, intergenerational echoes of severe psychological injury. In an attempt to alleviate Tom's nighttime suffering, a medication known to suppress nightmares was prescribed. Yet 2 weeks later, Tom confessed he had not taken a single pill. His reasoning was a revelation that fundamentally altered the course of a professional lifetime. Banishing the nightmares felt like a betrayal. He believed he had to endure the torment as a living monument to the men who had perished alongside him. This profound, paralyzing loyalty to the dead tethered him to a past he could not escape, rendering his present life meaningless. It was a stark realization that surviving a trauma involves far more than simply adjusting damaged brain chemistry. It is a complex crisis of meaning, memory, and an identity shattered by unspeakable loss. The medical establishment of the era offered shockingly little guidance. The clinic library held no volumes on combat trauma, reflecting a societal and professional amnesia regarding the psychological casualties of war. The only beacon of understanding was a decades-old text anticipating the psychiatric fallout of the Second World War, which astutely identified these conditions not as mere mental weaknesses, but as physiological neuroses, disorders rooted deeply in the body's enduring response to overwhelming threat. This biological perspective, combined with the wisdom of mentors who taught that the patient is the only true textbook, underscored the agonizing difficulty of confronting the unvarnished truth. Society instinctively recoils from the gruesome realities of combat and domestic abuse, preferring the comfort of denial. It is little wonder, then, that those who bear these burdens often resort to extreme measures to numb their own unbearable knowledge. To understand the architecture of this suffering, one must delve into the precipitating events. Veterans like Tom often deployed with a profound sense of camaraderie, forging bonds tighter than brotherhood. Tom had found his anchor in a fellow soldier named They shared everything from letters from home to the mundane routines of military life. This bond was obliterated in an instant during a twilight patrol when sudden enemy fire wiped out the platoon. The indelible image of Alex lying lifeless in a rice paddy became the epicenter of Tom's psychological collapse. That single moment destroyed not only his closest friend, but the part of Tom's own soul that believed in goodness and trust. The horror of the ambush was compounded by the atrocities that followed. Consumed by an unfathomable grief and blinding rage, Tom participated in a retaliatory rampage through a nearby village, committing acts of violence against civilians that forever severed his connection to his own humanity. The shame of these actions created an impenetrable barrier between him and his family. How could he look into the eyes of his innocent children or embrace his loving wife when his hands were stained with such unthinkable transgressions? This crushing guilt, whether born of active participation in violence or the agonizing compromises made to survive, forms a suffocating prison. This deep-seated trauma frequently manifests as a profound emotional anesthesia. For individuals carrying such burdens, the capacity to feel love, joy, or even simple contentment is entirely frozen. They exist behind an invisible pane of glass, alienated not only from their loved ones, but from their own reflections. The only respite from this crushing numbness often comes through high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled engagement. For Tom, defending a client in a high-pressure trial mimicked the intense focus of combat, temporarily reviving his sense of purpose. Yet the moment the trial concluded, the darkness returned, bringing with it the terrifying flashbacks and the explosive rage, driving him back to isolation, substance abuse, and the reckless pursuit of physical danger just to feel a pulse of life. The impact of such experiences extends far beyond emotional dampening. It fundamentally reorganizes the way the mind perceives reality. This was vividly demonstrated by another veteran, a former medic who experienced a severe panic attack simply from hearing his newborn baby cry. The sound bypassed rational thought, instantly plunging him into a horrific flashback of dying children in a war zone. Initially misdiagnosed by colleagues as a psychotic break, it became evident that he was not hallucinating a break from reality, but suffering from a relentless, intrusive memory. Psychological assessments using ambiguous images like ink blots further illuminated this perceptual distortion. When presented with a colorful blot, traumatized veterans did not see the benign or whimsical shapes imagined by the general public. They saw the visceral, gruesome remnants of their fallen comrades. They superimposed their horrific past onto the present neutral stimulus. Others in the study exhibited the opposite extreme, a complete perceptual void, seeing nothing but ink. Both reactions indicated a devastating loss of imagination. Imagination is the engine of hope and the foundation of a meaningful future. Without it, individuals remain eternally captive to the last moment they felt intense emotion, unable to envision any reality beyond their past terror. Efforts to provide therapeutic holding spaces for these men revealed the profound depth of their entrapment. In group settings, veterans would sit in agonizing silence regarding their current lives, only to become intensely animated when recounting the visceral details of their combat experiences. Whether the trauma was a decade old or spanned back to the battlefields of Europe a generation prior, the pattern remained identical. The very experiences that had caused their ruin had paradoxically become their sole source of meaning and connection. They could only feel alive when communing with the ghosts of their past, rendering their wives, children, and civilian careers pale and insignificant by comparison. The clinical approach to these profound wounds was, for a long time, tragically misguided. Patients were labeled with various disjointed diagnoses and medicated into stupors, while attempts to talk through their traumas often only triggered debilitating flashbacks. A monumental shift occurred when advocacy efforts finally secured the recognition of a specific syndrome, grouping these symptoms under the umbrella of post-traumatic stress. This conceptual framework validated the suffering of those overwhelmed by horror and helplessness, paving the way for systematic research into the biological underpinnings of traumatic memory. Yet, institutional resistance remained formidable. Proposals to study the unique biology of these unyielding memories were initially dismissed as irrelevant. This This blindness prompted a transition from the veterans' clinics to general psychiatric hospitals, where the same patterns of suffering were soon recognized in civilian populations. Women bearing the hidden scars of childhood sexual abuse exhibited the exact same constellations of symptoms: the nightmares, the alternating rage and numbness, and the profound inability to trust. Despite textbooks of the era dismissing the prevalence and severity of incest, the clinical reality was undeniable. The devastation of the battlefield was mirrored in the bedrooms and living rooms of ordinary homes, affecting millions with a hidden epidemic of violence and betrayal. Decades of subsequent observation and the advent of sophisticated brain imaging technology have revolutionized our comprehension of this suffering. Trauma is no longer understood merely as a difficult memory. It is a profound alteration of the organism's nervous system. It fundamentally changes how the brain and mind process perceptions, creating bodies that remain perpetually locked in a state of hyperarousal, bracing for an assault that belongs to the past. While giving voice to these agonizing experiences is a vital step, the mere act of storytelling is insufficient to reset an alarm system that is chemically and structurally wired for survival. True healing requires engaging the body itself, teaching the recalibrated nervous system that the danger has finally passed, and allowing the individual to inhabit the present moment with safety and vitality. Chapter 2: Revolutions in Understanding Mind and Brain. The dawning of a career in the care of the human mind often begins in the quiet, unsettling hours before sunrise. In the mid-20th century, the prevailing psychiatric culture was heavily steeped in orthodox psychoanalytic tradition. The corridors of esteemed mental health institutions were filled with patients wrestling with profound despair, erratic behavior, and debilitating emotional pain. The standard therapeutic lens of the era viewed these agonizing symptoms as manifestations of internal conflicts, repressed infantile fantasies, and unconscious desires. Yet, sitting with deeply distressed individuals and listening closely to their nightmarish realities, stories of violent households, systemic abuse, and profound neglect revealed a glaring, tragic disconnect. The dominant theories suggested that much of this suffering was born of imagination or complex internal drives gone awry. However, the raw, undeniable terror radiating from these people spoke of very real external horrors. The strict insistence on treating these deeply wounded individuals through the detached, intellectualized framework of psychoanalysis often proved not just ineffective, but actively harmful. Asking a survivor to repeatedly dissect their psychic pain without offering a tangible physical or emotional anchor frequently amplified their distress, trapping them in a relentless, agonizing loop of reliving the very atrocities that had shattered their lives in the first place. A crucial pivot in understanding the true mechanics of this profound psychological collapse emerged not from the analyst's couch, but from the rigorous empirical realm of behavioral science. Laboratory experiments involving animals exposed to unavoidable electrical shocks provided a stark, harrowing mirror to human trauma. When subjects were subjected to repeated, unpredictable pain from which there was no physical escape, they eventually ceased all efforts to flee. Even when the barriers were later removed and safety was freely available, the animals remained huddled in a state of defeated collapse. This phenomenon vividly illustrated how overwhelming, inescapable terror fundamentally alters the nervous system's core motivational centers. The very capacity to take action, to imagine a route to safety, is entirely extinguished. For human beings trapped in inescapable cycles of domestic violence, chronic childhood abuse, or prolonged captivity, this exact biological shutdown occurs. The profound apathy, paralyzing depression, and physical immobility so frequently observed in survivors are not signs of inherent weakness or character flaws. They are the physiological legacy of a nervous system that was forced to adapt to inescapable agony by entirely shutting down the biological mechanisms of active defense. Paradoxically, alongside this profound physical and emotional collapse, another bewildering pattern frequently emerges among those who have endured severe trauma, a seemingly magnetic pullback toward danger. Observers and loved ones often struggle to comprehend why individuals might repeatedly engage in high-risk behaviors, return to abusive partners, or inflict severe physical harm upon themselves. The explanation lies hidden deep within the body's chemical survival responses. In moments brain releases a massive flood of endogenous opioids, the body's natural painkillers, to blunt the physical and emotional agony of the assault. Over time, the nervous system can become deeply accustomed to this intense chemical cocktail. When the external crisis finally fades, the subsequent drop in these internal neurochemicals can plunge the individual into a state of numbing withdrawal and an agonizing feeling of inner deadness. To counteract this terrifying void, survivors may unconsciously seek out situations that trigger a new surge of stress hormones. The chaos and danger become the only reliable catalysts capable of making them feel momentarily alive, or of providing a temporary chemical relief from the crushing weight of their internal emptiness. Even acts of self-mutilation serve this tragic physiological purpose, offering a sharp, physical focal point that distracts from unmanageable emotional chaos and triggers a brief, soothing wave of natural opioids. As the profound limitations of purely conversational therapy for severe trauma became starkly apparent, the field of psychiatry underwent a radical chemical transformation. The mid to late 20th century witnessed the introduction of powerful psychotropic medications capable of fundamentally altering brain chemistry. For the first time, there were tangible pharmacological tools to dampen the terrifying hallucinations, severe depressions, and manic rages that consumed so many lives. The subsequent development of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors further revolutionized the landscape, offering millions a vital buffer against crippling anxiety and chronic despair. This pharmacological triumph brought undeniable relief to countless individuals, allowing them to function within a society that previously would have locked them away. However, this chemical revolution also introduced a profound systemic blind spot. The focus of psychiatric care shifted overwhelmingly toward managing symptoms rather than understanding their origins. The vast, intricate narratives of human suffering were increasingly reduced to biological deficits, neatly categorized within diagnostic manuals that largely ignored the environmental and relational contexts of the individual's life. Medication could effectively soothe a hyperactive threat response system, but it could not rewrite the traumatic experiences encoded in the body, nor could it teach a shattered individual how to forge safe, meaningful connections with other human beings. This growing reliance on chemical symptom management fostered a dominant medical paradigm where profound emotional distress was increasingly labeled as a primary brain disease. Yet, a deeper examination of the lives of traumatized individuals demands a radical reframing of this perspective. The erratic behaviors, the sudden explosive rage, the debilitating dissociation, and the profound mistrust are not arbitrary malfunctions of a broken brain. They are, in fact, highly effective logical adaptations to environments where terror, betrayal, and violence were the prevailing norms. The hypervigilance that makes a child impossible to manage in a peaceful classroom was the exact mechanism that kept them alive in a household governed by a volatile, abusive parent. The emotional numbing that destroys an adult's capacity for intimacy was the very shield that allowed them to endure the unendurable during prolonged assaults. To label these deeply ingrained survival strategies merely as pathologies or diseases is to fundamentally misunderstand the staggering resilience of the human organism. True healing requires shifting the focus away from merely identifying what is wrong with an individual and instead deeply inquiring into what happened to them. It demands an acknowledgement that the mind and body have heroically organized themselves to survive the past, and that the profound task of recovery is not about curing an abstract illness, but about safely guiding the entire nervous system out of the trauma of the past and into the reality of the present. Chapter 3. Looking into the brain, the neuroscience revolution. For decades, the mechanisms of the human mind were largely hidden from view. Scientists could measure the chemicals that fueled neural activity, an approach akin to examining the fuel of a vehicle to understand its mechanics. But the internal machinery itself remained an inaccessible mystery. In the early 1990s, however, a monumental shift occurred. The dawn of highly sophisticated neuroimaging technologies such as positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging allowed researchers to finally peer through the skull. For the first time, it was possible to observe the brain in real time as it processed sensations, memories, and emotions. This technological leap fundamentally altered our comprehension of psychological trauma, transitioning the field from abstract theory to observable biology. At Harvard Medical school, this new frontier opened up unprecedented opportunities. When the Massachusetts General Hospital established its neuroimaging laboratory, an ambitious project was conceived to visualize the exact neural activity of individuals trapped in the grip of a flashback. 8 brave individuals, haunted by intrusive images and sudden sensory ambushes from their past, volunteered to be placed inside a scanner. To capture the precise moment of a traumatic intrusion, researchers crafted detailed, individualized scripts based on the fragmented sensations of each person's worst memory. These scripts did not focus on the narrative of the event, but on the raw, isolated elements, the specific sights, sounds, and physical feelings of the horror. A second script was also designed for each participant, describing a mundane, safe scenario such as brushing one's teeth or looking out over a peaceful landscape to serve as a baseline comparison. Marsha was the first to undergo the procedure. A 40-year-old educator, she had been a vibrant, joyful woman until a catastrophic split-second 13 years earlier altered her existence permanently. While driving her 5-year-old daughter home from camp, she momentarily reached over to check a beeping seatbelt alarm. In that fleeting distraction, she ran a red light, and a collision instantly claimed the life of her daughter, as well as the 7-month-old child she was carrying in her womb. The tragedy extinguished her vitality, leaving her severely depressed and unable to bear the joyful noises of children which had become agonizing triggers. As Marsha lay within the scanner and the audio recording of her traumatic script began to play, her physiological state erupted. Monitors tracked a sudden, violent surge in her heart rate and blood pressure. The mere auditory reminder of the crash provoked the identical biological panic she had endured over a decade prior. When the recording ended and the baseline script was played, her vitals stabilized, but she emerged from the machine looking utterly shattered and vulnerable, her breathing shallow and her shoulders hunched in defenselessness. The resulting scans, once compiled and analyzed, were akin to mapping a newly discovered galaxy. A vibrant cluster of activity illuminated the right lower center of her brain, the limbic region, and specifically the amygdala. This ancient structure serves as the organism's threat detector, responsible for initiating the body's survival responses. The images provided undeniable proof that when a survivor is triggered, the brain does not recognize the passage of time. To the amygdala, the 13-year-old catastrophe was happening in that exact fraction of a second, flooding the body with an emergency cascade of stress hormones. Perhaps the most astonishing revelation from the neuroimaging data was a state of speechless horror, visually represented by a distinct darkened void in the left frontal lobe. This deactivated region was Broca's area, the neural center responsible for translating thoughts and feelings into articulated speech. In victims of strokes, damage to this area results in the physical inability to speak. The scans vividly demonstrated that a psychological flashback mimics this physical brain lesion, effectively shutting down the capacity for language. Trauma, at its very core, exists in a pre-verbal realm. When individuals are pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, words fail. They may howl, freeze, or emit guttural cries, but the organized articulation of their suffering collapses. Years later, survivors often find it monumentally difficult to describe what they endured. While they may eventually construct a superficial narrative to offer an explanation to the outside world, this story rarely touches the profound, chaotic truth of their inner devastation. The sheer magnitude of the experience severs them from the realm of shared human language. In stark contrast to the silenced speech center, another part of the brain, Rodman's Area 19, located in the visual cortex, burned brightly on the scans. This region registers raw, incoming visual data before it is interpreted by higher brain functions. The fact that this area was hyperactive meant that the participants were not merely remembering their past, they were visually experiencing the fragmented images of their horror as if the sensory data were hitting their retinas for the very first time. The imaging also exposed a profound shifting to one side of the brain. During the flashbacks, the right hemisphere was intensely active, while the left hemisphere was significantly dampened. The two halves of the human brain govern entirely different domains of experience. The right side is the intuitive, sensory, and emotional half. It processes the non-verbal music of our lives, reacting to facial expressions, tones of voice, and the visceral feel of the world. It develops earliest in infancy and holds the intuitive truths of our physical reality. The left brain, by contrast, is analytical, sequential, and linguistic center. It categorizes facts, creates logical narratives, and allows us to make sense of cause and effect. In a healthy state, these hemispheres communicate flawlessly. But trauma forces a catastrophic disconnection. The deactivation of the left hemisphere drastically impairs executive functioning, the ability to plan, to recognize the boundary between past and present, and to impose order on chaotic feelings. When a trigger activates a traumatized person's right brain, they are plunged into a vortex of raw emotion and physical panic. Because their logical left brain is essentially offline, they cannot rationalize the experience. They cannot recognize that they are simply remembering. Instead, they feel as though they are under immediate attack, leading to reactions such as explosive rage or sudden withdrawal that seem entirely disproportionate to the present moment, leaving them feeling as though they are losing their grip on reality. The physiological theater observed in the scanner provided a profound explanation for why survivors remain stuck in fight or flight. When Marsha's memory was triggered, the activation of her amygdala set off an immense wave of adrenaline and cortisol, the chemical messengers designed to fuel a life or death struggle. In a normal stress response, these hormones recede once the danger has passed, allowing the organism to return to a state of equilibrium. However, in the wake of profound psychological injury, this regulatory system is deeply damaged. The chemical alarm takes far longer to quiet down, and the threshold for activation is dramatically lowered. The body remains perpetually mobilized for an assault that belongs to history. This chronic elevation of stress hormones ravages the body and mind, manifesting as severe insomnia, chronic irritability, impaired concentration, and a host of long-term physical ailments. The individual remains locked in a state of suspended terror. Some survivors may appear outwardly calm, their conscious minds attempting to deny the internal chaos, but beneath the surface, the emotional brain continues to scream, sending relentless signals to the muscles to brace for impact. This biological reality exposes the severe limitations of purely conversational therapies. A rational understanding of one's past is entirely insufficient to pacify a neurochemical alarm system that perceives immediate, mortal peril. True recovery demands that the fragmented sensory imprints of the trauma be integrated, allowing the brain's internal timekeeper to finally recognize that the danger is over and permitting the individual to safely inhabit the present moment. Chapter 4: Running for Your Life. The Anatomy of Survival. On the morning of the September 11th attacks, a 5-year-old boy named Noam bore witness to an unimaginable catastrophe. From the windows of his classroom, mere blocks away from the World Trade Center, he watched the first plane strike. Amidst the chaos, he and his classmates fled the building, reuniting with panicked parents and running for their lives through the blinding ash and debris of Lower Manhattan. Visiting his family shortly after, a deeply moving revelation emerged. Noam had drawn a picture of the disaster, the burning tower, the jumping figures, the firefighters. But at the base of the crumbling skyscrapers, he had added a large black circle. When asked what it was, the young boy explained it was a trampoline, placed there so that the next time people had to jump, they would be safe. This profound act of imagination demonstrated a vital aspect of human resilience. Because Noam was able to physically run from the danger alongside a loving, protective father, his biological alarm bells could eventually quiet down. Once safe, his mind remained fluid enough to process the horror and actively envision a creative, life-saving solution. By stark contrast, traumatized individuals find their growth arrested because their nervous systems are entirely blocked from integrating the event. Instead of the trauma becoming a finite chapter of the past, the survivor's entire existence remains organized around an invisible, immutable threat. The immense energy required to suppress the chaotic internal aftermath strips them of their spontaneous engagement with the present world, often manifesting in debilitating physical ailments and chronic exhaustion. To truly heal, the interventions must address the entirety of the human organism. Understanding how we are organized to survive is the first step in addressing this systemic hijacking. When the organism detects a mortal threat, it initiates hardwired, automatic physical escape plans orchestrated by the oldest regions of the brain. These ancient structures temporarily override our conscious, rational thought, propelling the body to fight, flee, or freeze. If a person successfully executes this fight or flight response and escapes the danger, the body's internal equilibrium is eventually restored. However, if this biological imperative is thwarted, if the individual is pinned down, trapped in a mangled vehicle, or paralyzed by domestic terror, the brain's alarm circuits continue to fire helplessly. The nervous system becomes flooded with stress chemicals, relentlessly driving the body to flee a danger that has already passed, locking the survivor in a state of perpetual, agonizing mobilization. To grasp the mechanics of this entrapment, one must examine the brain from bottom to top. The primary objective of the brain is not philosophy or art, but sheer survival. Our rational cognitive apparatus, the neocortex, occupies a relatively small portion of our skull and is evolutionarily young, tasked with logic, language, and navigating the external world. Beneath it lie the ancient systems that manage our moment-to-moment physiology. The foundation is the reptilian brain, fully functional at birth, located in the brainstem. It manages basic life-sustaining housekeeping, breathing, digestion, sleep, and waking. Above it sits the limbic system, or mammalian brain. This is the command center for emotions, danger detection, and social connection. Shaped heavily by early life experiences, it wires itself based on use. A nurtured child develops circuits primed for exploration, while a neglected child's limbic system becomes specialized in detecting fear. Together, the reptilian and limbic structures form the emotional brain, operating with global, rapid assessments and triggering visceral, pre-programmed responses long before the rational mind can comprehend the situation. At the very top lies the neocortex, housing the frontal lobes, which grant us our capacity for abstract thought, temporal planning, and the conscious modulation of our impulses. A crucial function of these frontal lobes is mirroring each other, the foundation of interpersonal neurobiology. Within the cortex exist mirror neurons, sophisticated cells that fire not only when we perform an action, but when we observe someone else performing it. This neural resonance is the biological basis for empathy, allowing us to intuit the intentions and emotional states of our fellow human beings. It enables the synchronized rhythms of a dance or the shared sorrow of a tragedy. However, this same mechanism renders us highly susceptible to the negative energies of others, meaning that trauma inherently involves a catastrophic breakdown of this mirroring process, the agonizing experience of not being seen, recognized, or aided by the tribe. The process of identifying danger relies on two distinct structures, the cook and the smoke detector. All incoming sensory data, sights, sounds, smells, first converges in the thalamus, which acts as the brain's culinary center, blending these disparate ingredients into the coherent soup of our conscious autobiographical experience. The thalamus then relays this information along two pathways. The high road travels up to the conscious frontal lobes, while the low road shoots directly down to the amygdala, the brain's smoke detector. The amygdala works with breathtaking speed to assess the emotional relevance of the stimuli. If it detects a threat, it immediately recruits the hypothalamus to flood the body with stress hormones, bracing the organism for impact before the rational brain has even registered the event. In traumatized individuals, this smoke detector becomes hypersensitive, prone to misinterpreting innocuous social cues as signals of mortal peril leading to explosive or withdrawn behavior. Controlling the stress response falls to the watchtower, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex. While the amygdala sounds the alarm, the watchtower provides the necessary perspective, determining whether the perceived smoke is a burning house or simply a scorched meal. By hovering mindfully over our physiological reactions, the frontal lobes can inhibit the emotional brain's hardwired panic, aborting the stress response and preserving our social functioning. In post-traumatic stress, this delicate balance shifts disastrously. Neuroimaging reveals that intense emotional arousal effectively shuts down the inhibitory functions of the medial prefrontal cortex. The individual is left at the mercy of their hyperactive alarm system. Re-establishing this balance requires either top-down regulation, using mindfulness to strengthen the watchtower's capacity to observe sensations, or bottom-up regulation, utilizing breath, movement, and touch to physically pacify the frantic autonomic nervous system. The dynamic between these brain regions is much like the rider and the horse. The rational brain is the rider, capable of guiding the journey as long as the path is smooth. But the emotional brain is a powerful horse, and if it is startled by a perceived threat, it will bolt, rendering the rider's commands useless. This biological reality explains why purely cognitive, insight-oriented therapies routinely fail to cure severe trauma. No amount of logical reasoning can talk an inflamed amygdala out of its terror. The internal tug-of-war is fought in the viscera, the heart, the gut, the lungs, and true resolution requires descending into this sensory theater to tame the frightened animal within. The concrete reality of this neural disruption was vividly demonstrated by Stan and Ute's brains on trauma. This professional couple survived a catastrophic 87-car highway pileup trapped in their crushed vehicle while listening to a woman burn to death nearby. Months later, unable to sleep and haunted by the horror, they participated in a neuroimaging study. When Stan's brain was scanned while listening to a script of the accident, he instantly plunged into a flashback. His heart raced, his blood pressure spiked, and his body began sweating profusely. Inside the scanner, Stan was not remembering the crash, he was biologically reliving it. This illustrates the core mechanism of dissociation and reliving. Trauma shatters the experience into unintegrated fragments of raw sensation and emotion. These fragments do not simply fade, they lie dormant, ready to intrude upon the present at the slightest provocation. Flashbacks are uniquely agonizing because they are entirely unpredictable, hijacking the survivor's reality and forcing them to organize their entire existence around avoiding potential triggers. The relentless flooding of stress hormones engraves these physiological responses ever deeper, making it impossible for the individual to fully inhabit the present moment or experience the simple joys of daily life. The trauma is no longer an external event. It has become an unending war waged within the survivor's own nervous system. During Stan's flashback, the neuroimaging revealed that his smoke detector goes on overdrive. The right amygdala blazed with activity, signaling immediate life-threatening danger, completely oblivious to the fact that he was lying safely in a medical facility months after the event. The alarm system was functioning exactly as it should during a catastrophic collision, but its persistent activation in the absence of real danger transforms it into a debilitating prison. Simultaneously, the scans showed that the timekeeper collapses. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for contextualizing experience and maintaining a linear sense of time, was deactivated. Without this neural timekeeper, the individual cannot recognize that the agonizing experience is finite and belongs to history. They are trapped in a suspended moment of absolute horror, feeling with visceral certainty that the terror will last forever. Furthermore, the thalamus shuts down during the flashback. The brain's cook goes offline, failing to integrate the incoming sensory data into a coherent autobiographical narrative. This explains why traumatic memories do not present as logical stories, but as chaotic, overwhelming sensory imprints, a particular smell, a specific sound, a crushing physical sensation. With the thalamus disabled, its vital function as a sensory filter is also lost, leaving the survivor suffering from relentless sensory overload, forced to shut down their emotional capacity entirely just to cope with the chaotic influx of stimuli. While Stan reacted with frantic hyperarousal, Ute's scan revealed the opposite extreme, depersonalization and being split off from the self. When exposed to the same trauma script, Ute's mind simply went blank. Nearly every region of her brain showed a profound decrease in activity, and her vital signs remained flat. She felt nothing. This biological freeze reaction was a survival mechanism forged during a childhood of maternal neglect and verbal abuse, a deeply ingrained habit of making her mind disappear when confronted with overwhelming distress. When the multi-car pileup occurred, her brain instinctively defaulted to this ancient strategy of profound disconnection. These divergent but equally paralyzing responses underscore the ultimate objective of trauma therapy: learning to live in the present. Desensitization to past horrors is woefully insufficient if it merely leaves the survivor feeling numb. The true challenge is to coax the offline brain structures back into operation, allowing the individual to safely inhabit their physical body and fully engage with the vibrant, immediate reality of their ongoing lives. Chapter 5: Body-Brain Connections. Long before the advent of modern brain imaging, keen observers of the natural world recognized the profound visceral link between intense emotion and physical biology. Charles Darwin famously noted that the mind and the body's vital organs intricately tethered, connected by a massive neural pathway he termed the pneumogastric nerve. Today, we know this as the vagus nerve, the sprawling biological cable that extends from the brainstem down through the muscles of the face, the vocal cords, the heart, the lungs, and deep into the gut. This profound neurobiological connection explains why agonizing grief feels like a physical ache in the chest, and why sudden terror manifests as a sickening drop in the stomach. To understand the lingering devastation of trauma, one must look beyond the confines of the skull and examine the entirety of the autonomic nervous system. The flexibility of this system can be directly observed through the subtle fluctuations of our internal rhythms, particularly the continuous, intimate dance between our respiration and our heartbeat. With every inhalation, the heart rate naturally accelerates slightly, preparing the body for engagement. With every exhalation, it slows down, signaling a return to rest. This physiological elasticity, known as heart rate variability, serves as a direct window into the nervous system's capacity to modulate stress. In a resilient, healthy individual, this variability is robust, allowing the body to seamlessly transition between states of arousal and calm. In those burdened by severe trauma, however, this rhythmic flexibility is often shattered. The system becomes rigid, locked into a perpetual state of hyperarousal, or flattened into a chronic, lifeless baseline, stripping the organism of its capacity to gracefully navigate the changing demands of daily life. This intricate internal machinery was revolutionized by a groundbreaking framework that illuminated the evolutionary trajectory of the autonomic nervous system. Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory provided the biological map for what might be called the neural love code, fundamentally shifting the paradigm of how we understand human connection and survival. For millions of years, early vertebrates possessed only a primitive, unmyelinated vagus nerve, which managed basic metabolic functions and orchestrated the ultimate survival response, feigning death when captured by a predator. As evolution progressed, the sympathetic nervous system emerged, granting organisms the vital capacity for active defense, the explosive energy required to fight or flee. But it was the dawn of mammalian life that brought about the most sophisticated biological innovation. Mammals, utterly dependent on their mothers for survival at birth, developed a new, myelinated branch of the vagus nerve. This ventral neural pathway connects the brainstem to the muscles of the face, the middle ear, and the heart. It is the anatomical foundation of social engagement, allowing us to signal our internal states, interpret the intentions of others, and soothe one another through subtle facial expressions and the melodic pitch of our voices. Because of this evolutionary heritage, human beings are profoundly, inextricably social creatures. Our nervous systems are not isolated biological silos. They are exquisitely designed to resonate with and regulate the nervous systems of those around us. This biological imperative means that our deepest sense of safety is tethered to our connections with others. When we are met with welcoming eyes, a warm, resonant tone of voice, and a relaxed posture, our social engagement system signals the heart and lungs to slow down, allowing us to digest our food, heal our physical wounds, and engage in the complex cognitive tasks of learning and creativity. This continuous loop of interpersonal regulation is the bedrock of human thriving. However, trauma fundamentally violates this biological contract. When the very people who are supposed to provide sanctuary become the source of terror, or when an individual is violently severed from their protective community, the social engagement system collapses. The agonizing isolation of trauma is not merely a psychological feeling of loneliness, it is a profound physiological crisis. Without the regulating presence of safe others, the shattered nervous system is left entirely to its own devices, rapidly descending into more primitive, chaotic states of survival. The polyvagal theory delineates three distinct phylogenetic stages of the autonomic nervous system, functioning essentially as a hierarchy of defense. When we feel completely secure, the newest evolutionary system, the ventral vagus complex, is in command. We are socially engaged, our faces are expressive, our hearing is fine-tuned to human speech, and our physiology is optimized for connection. If this system fails to resolve a threat, or if the danger is immediate and severe, the organism automatically downshifts to the second level of defense, the older sympathetic nervous system. Here, the social engagement system is forcibly deactivated. The heart races, adrenaline surges, and the body mobilizes for violent action or desperate flight. The the individual no longer cares about nuanced communication or connection. The sole objective is to survive the physical encounter. Yet there are horrors from which one cannot run, and battles that simply cannot be won. When active resistance is entirely futile, when a child is pinned down by an abusive adult, or a victim is hopelessly trapped in a mangled vehicle, the nervous system makes its final, desperate maneuver. It shifts abruptly from the highly mobilized state of fight or flight to the most primitive survival strategy of all: total biological collapse. The ancient, unmyelinated dorsal branch of the vagus nerve forcefully takes over, drastically plummeting the heart rate, shutting down digestion, and plunging the organism into a state of profound immobilization, dissociation, and metabolic conservation. The individual essentially disappears from their own body, enduring the unbearable physical or emotional agony by ceasing to register it altogether. This profound physiological shutdown is frequently misunderstood by outside observers and agonizingly shamed by survivors themselves, who mistakenly interpret their biological paralysis as a failure of courage or a sign of complicity. The foundation for navigating these complex biological states is laid at the very beginning of life. The intricate process of how our nervous systems are sculpted is fundamentally interpersonal. An infant's neural architecture is incomplete at birth. It relies entirely on the attuned presence of a caregiver to organize itself. Through countless micro-interactions, the locking of gazes, the matching of joyful vocalizations, the soothing rhythmic cadence of a lullaby, the mother and child engage in a synchronized biological dance. These reciprocal exchanges physically wire the child's developing brain, strengthening the ventral vagal pathways and building a robust social engagement system. When a caregiver is emotionally present and responsive, the child learns on a visceral level that distress is temporary and that the world is a manageable place. Conversely, if a caregiver is chronically depressed, absent, or themselves a source of terror, this vital biological synchrony never occurs. The infant's nervous system is forced to adapt to a world devoid of safe reciprocity, perpetually skewing toward frantic hypervigilance or profound, lifeless withdrawal, altering the trajectory of their physical and emotional development for decades to come. Our brains are continuously engaged in a subconscious process of evaluating the surrounding environment, a vital mechanism known as neuroception. Below the threshold of conscious thought, our neural circuits are constantly scanning the horizon and the faces of those around us, asking, is it safe to lower my guard, or must I defend my life? In a healthy, well-regulated system, this assessment is highly accurate, but severe trauma critically damages the neuroceptive radar. The brain's alarm system becomes chronically calibrated to expect betrayal and danger, causing survivors to misinterpret neutral or even benign facial expressions as signals of deep hostility. Conversely, the system may become dangerously numbed, failing to register legitimate red flags and leaving the individual highly vulnerable to further exploitation and abuse. This broken compass means that traumatized individuals cannot simply be intellectually persuaded into feeling safe. Even in the presence of genuine care and a secure environment, their internal biology screams that they are under imminent threat, making true relaxation an agonizingly elusive state. Acknowledging this profound neurobiological reality mandates a radical departure from traditional therapeutic models. If the deeply ingrained legacy of trauma is encoded in the visceral responses of the autonomic nervous system, then merely analyzing the past through conscious dialogue is inherently insufficient. Recovery must actively engage the vagus nerve and restore the shattered rhythms of the physical body. Interventions must bypass the rational brain and target the physiological scaffolding of the social engagement system. Practices that deliberately manipulate the breath, such as mindful movement or specific respiratory exercises, directly influence heart rate variability, sending powerful, visceral signals of safety up into the inflamed emotional brain. Group singing, rhythmic chanting, and even the physical synchronization found in theater employ the precise vocal frequencies and facial engagements required to stimulate the ventral vagus. These profound embodied experiences gently coax the nervous system out of its terrified isolation and back into the regulating rhythm of human connection, allowing the organism to finally recognize that the war has ended. Chapter 6. Losing your body. Losing yourself. The deepest, most agonizing tragedy of psychological trauma is not merely the terrifying event itself, but the enduring aftermath in which the survivor's own physical form becomes an enemy. Under normal circumstances, the human body is a sanctuary, a reliable vessel that roots us in the present moment and provides a continuous stream of sensory information to help us navigate the world. However, when an individual is subjected to overwhelming terror, inescapable abuse, or profound betrayal, this vital sanctuary is fundamentally violated. The physical sensations associated with the trauma, the crushing weight of helplessness, the sickening spikes of adrenaline, the visceral agony of physical violation, become deeply encoded in the nervous system. Long after the external threat has vanished, the body continues to generate these terrifying sensations, functioning as an internal minefield of unbearable triggers. To survive this relentless physiological assault, traumatized individuals are often forced to execute a desperate unconscious maneuver. They sever the connection between their conscious mind and their physical body. They learn to numb their internal landscape, retreating into the fortress of the mind to escape the agonizing sensations rippling through their flesh. This profound alienation from the physical form manifests in deeply troubling ways. Many survivors lose the basic capacity to accurately identify or describe what they are feeling, a condition clinically referred to as alexithymia. When asked to articulate their emotional state, they often draw a complete, frustrating blank. The nuanced vocabulary of human emotion, the subtle distinctions between sadness, anger, disappointment, or fear, is entirely inaccessible to them. Instead, the suppressed emotional chaos frequently bypasses conscious awareness and erupts as severe, localized physical distress. A survivor might complain of chronic migraines, paralyzing muscle tension, or severe gastrointestinal agony, completely unaware that these physical ailments are the direct, somatic manifestations of unacknowledged emotional terror. They may act out aggressively, fall into profound despair, or engage in reckless behaviors, yet remain completely disconnected from the internal motivations driving their actions. The body continues to keep a meticulous ledger of the past horror, but the conscious mind has deliberately lost the ability to read the entries. To truly comprehend the magnitude of this loss, one must understand the biological foundation of human consciousness. The fundamental sense of being alive, of possessing a cohesive, enduring identity, is not merely an intellectual construct generated by abstract thought. It is intricately tethered to interoception, the brain's continuous conscious awareness of the body's internal, visceral state. Our core sense of self is built upon a ceaseless stream of sensory data ascending from the heart, the lungs, the gut, and the muscles up into the deep structures of the brain. It is through these subtle internal shifts, the quickening of a pulse in anticipation, the sinking feeling in the stomach dread, the expansive warmth in the chest during moments of joy, that we interpret our environment, make vital decisions, and understand who we are in relation to the world around us. Neuroimaging provides a stark, chilling visual representation of how trauma dismantles this biological foundation. When individuals burdened by severe post-traumatic stress are placed inside a brain scanner, the regions responsible for processing these internal physical sensations, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex and the insula, frequently show drastically reduced activity. In a desperate, neurological bid to shut out the overwhelming terror of the past, the brain has effectively cut the transmission lines ascending from the viscera. The biological dampening, however, operates as a blunt instrument. By blocking the agonizing physical sensations of fear, shame, and helplessness, the traumatized nervous system inadvertently extinguishes the individual's capacity to feel anything at all. The very same neural pathways that carry the unbearable weight of terror are also the conduits for the expansive, vitalizing sensations of love, physical pleasure, and profound joy. By numbing the agony, survivors inadvertently numb their entire existence, leaving them existing in a state of suspended animation, biologically surviving, yet fundamentally stripped of the visceral, embodied experience of truly living. Because the traumatized individual is profoundly alienated from their own internal landscape, they inevitably find themselves incapable of truly attuning to the emotional states of those around them. A robust, securely anchored sense of self is the absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for engaging in meaningful, reciprocal relationships. The nuanced, intricate dance of human connection relies heavily on our ability to intuitively read and respond to subtle matching a warm vocal tone or sharing a subtle shift in physical posture. When a person's own internal compass is deliberately broken, this vital interpersonal resonance is entirely lost. They cannot safely connect with a partner, nurture a child, or build a trusting community if they are terrified of the sensations within their own skin. They remain profoundly isolated, trapped behind an invisible, impenetrable barrier of internal numbness. The monumental task of healing, therefore, demands far more than intellectual insight or the construction of a coherent narrative about the past. True recovery necessitates a deliberate, gradual, and incredibly courageous return to the physical body. Survivors must be safely and patiently guided to reawaken their dormant sensory pathways. They must learn the agonizingly difficult skill of noticing, tolerating, and eventually befriending the ebb and flow of their internal sensations without being instantly hijacked by the ancient panic of the trauma. Traditional conversational therapies alone are fundamentally unequipped for this visceral reclamation. Instead, practices that cultivate deep, non-judgmental bodily awareness serve as the vital bridge back to the self. Focused mindfulness, rhythmic and conscious breathing, and deliberate grounding physical movement allow the traumatized nervous system to slowly recognize that internal sensations are not precursors to an imminent threat, but merely the natural rhythms of life. By painstakingly rebuilding the capacity for interoception, the individual slowly reclaims ownership of their physical vessel, reigniting the dormant neural circuits that allow them to feel safely anchored in the present moment, intimately connected to their own vitality, and finally capable of fully embracing the profound complexities of human connection. Chapter 7. Getting on the same wavelength. Attachment and attunement. The arrival of a human infant into the world is marked by a state of absolute, profound dependency. Unlike the offspring of many other species, who can walk, forage, and flee from danger within hours of birth, a human baby is entirely helpless. For the first several years of life, survival is explicitly tethered to the presence, protection, and responsiveness of older human beings. Because of this stark biological reality, the infant brain is not a static organ waiting to simply grow larger. It is an incredibly plastic, experience-dependent structure that literally wires itself based on the quality of the care it receives. The intricate neural networks that will eventually govern a child's capacity to manage distress, form loving relationships, and navigate complex social hierarchies are forged in the very first months of life through a continuous, visceral dialogue with a primary caregiver. For a significant portion of the 20th century, the medical and scientific communities fundamentally misunderstood this critical developmental window. The prevailing dogma of the era viewed child rearing through a cold, mechanistic lens. It was widely believed that as long as an infant's basic physiological needs were met, adequate caloric intake, a sanitary environment to prevent infectious disease, and physical shelter, the child would thrive. The concepts of maternal affection, physical tenderness, and emotional bonding were frequently dismissed by pediatric authorities as unscientific sentimentality, or worse, as indulgent behaviors that would spoil the child and create psychological weakness. This devastatingly flawed paradigm was eventually dismantled by keen observers who noticed a tragic phenomenon occurring in well-run, perfectly sterile orphanages and hospital wards. Infants who were separated from their mothers and cared for by a rotating staff of efficient but emotionally detached nurses began to physically deteriorate. Despite receiving proper nutrition and medical care, these babies would become listless, cease to grow, and sink into a state of profound physiological depression. Many simply stopped eating and succumbed to a condition known as marasmus, effectively wasting away from a literal lack of human touch and emotional engagement. It became undeniably clear that the human nervous system requires far more than calories to survive. It requires the regulating, resonant presence of another human being. The foundation of human thriving relies on a complex, wordless biological dance known as attunement. Long before a child can comprehend language, they are fluent in the micro-rhythms of interpersonal connection. When a mother holds her baby, she does not merely provide a physical resting place, she provides a regulatory framework for the infant's autonomic nervous system. When the baby coos, the mother intuitively adjusts her tone of voice, matching the pitch and returning the vocalization. When the baby becomes distressed, the mother's rhythmic rocking, the soothing cadence of her speech, and the gentle pressure of her embrace send direct, visceral signals to the infant's brainstem, effectively down-regulating the surge of stress hormones. Through thousands of these repetitive, reciprocal interactions, the baby internalizes a profound physiological lesson. Distress is temporary, comfort is available, and the world is a manageable place. The immense power of this nonverbal connection was brilliantly illuminated by the classic still face experiment. In this laboratory observation, a mother is asked to sit facing her infant and engage in their normal, playful interactions, smiling, talking, and responding to the baby's cues. The baby is joyous, physically animated, and deeply engaged. Then, upon a signal from the researchers, the mother is instructed to abruptly drop all emotion from her face, staring at her child with a completely blank, unresponsive expression. The infant's reaction is immediate and heartbreaking. The baby instantly recognizes the rupture in their biological connection. Initially, the child attempts to repair the breach, utilizing every tool at their disposal, smiling wider, pointing, reaching out, and vocalizing with increasing urgency, desperately trying to coax the mother back into the shared rhythm. When these efforts fail to elicit a response, the infant's nervous system plummets into a state of sheer panic. Within minutes, the baby completely dysregulates, crying inconsolably, physically turning away, and eventually collapsing into a posture of profound despair and withdrawal. This experiment visually demonstrates that for an infant, the sudden absence of emotional resonance is not merely confusing, it is a life-threatening physiological crisis. When a caregiver is chronically unable to engage in this vital attunement, whether due to severe postpartum depression, profound stress, substance abuse, or their own unresolved trauma, the developing child faces a catastrophic developmental hurdle. If the mother's face is consistently blank, hostile, or terrified, the infant's mirroring neurons reflect this chaos. The child's brain, desperate to adapt to its environment, wires its internal alarm system to a baseline of chronic anxiety or numb detachment. They learn to instinctively suppress their natural impulses for connection, realizing that their bids for attention will be met with terrifying unpredictability or agonizing silence. This early relational environment constructs the child's internal working model of the world. A securely attached child develops a neurological template that anticipates kindness, expects safety, and feels inherently worthy of protection. This internal map allows them to confidently explore their environment, secure in the knowledge that they possess a safe harbor to return to when frightened. Conversely, a child raised in the shadow of chronic misattunement or outright abuse develops a fundamentally altered map. Their nervous system becomes specialized in detecting threat, constantly scanning the environment for the next inevitable betrayal. They learn to view other human beings not as sources of comfort, but as potential predators or unpredictable sources of pain. This devastating worldview is not a conscious choice, but a biological adaptation to an environment devoid of secure resonance. Restoring synchrony. When the fundamental rhythms of early connection have been shattered, the resulting psychological and physiological disarray cannot be repaired through logic or rational instruction alone. A child whose nervous system is locked in a state of hypervigilant terror or profound dissociation cannot simply be talked out of their biological reality. To reach the deeply ingrained wounds of early developmental trauma, therapeutic interventions must bypass the cognitive brain and speak directly to the primitive regions of the nervous system where these foundational deficits reside. The key to unlocking this frozen state lies in intentionally rebuilding the physical and interpersonal rhythms that were absent during the child's formative years. Because trauma fundamentally isolates the individual, severing the innate capacity for reciprocal engagement, the most effective treatments involve carefully structured, sensory-rich experiences that demand active, embodied mirroring. When a therapist or a specialized caregiver engages a traumatized child in a simple game of tossing a ball back and forth, they are not merely playing, they are initiating a profound neurological dialogue. The anticipation of the catch, the physical coordination required to return the throw, and the shared eye contact all demand a level of present-moment physiological synchrony that directly stimulates the social engagement system. Therapeutic approaches that incorporate rhythmic physical attunement gently coax the traumatized nervous system out of its rigid defensive posture. Activities such as drumming together in a circle, matching physical postures in play, or engaging in reciprocal singing tap into the deeply embedded biological hunger for shared resonance. These synchronized movements and auditory rhythms engage the vagus nerve, sending powerful, non-verbal messages of safety and predictable connection directly into the brainstem and limbic system. For a child who has never experienced the soothing predictability of a regulated caregiver, these physical experiences are revolutionary. They provide the visceral proof that another human being can be safely engaged with, that intense arousal can be successfully modulated without resulting in violence or abandonment, and that their physical presence in the world can be a source of shared joy rather than inevitable suffering. Re-establishing this biological synchrony is the vital, non-negotiable prerequisite for higher-level healing. Only when the frantic, terrorized rhythms of the body have been quieted and the capacity for safe interpersonal mirroring has been painstakingly restored, can the mind finally feel secure enough to begin the arduous task of confronting and integrating the specific historical traumas that fractured the self. Chapter 8: Trapped in Relationships, the Cost of Abuse and Neglect. To truly understand the devastating impact of early abuse and neglect, one must examine the internal maps that individuals construct to navigate their interpersonal worlds. From the moment we are born, our environment dictates our understanding of reality. When a child is raised in an environment brimming with affection, where their presence elicits joy and their distress is met with comfort, they naturally internalize a worldview in which they are inherently valuable and safe. This foundational security becomes a lifelong compass. If, later in life, someone treats them with cruelty or disrespect, their internal map signals a profound mismatch. The mistreatment feels alien, prompting righteous indignation and the instinct to protect themselves. However, when the early environment is characterized by neglect, violence, or sexual exploitation, the developing brain constructs a fundamentally different map. The child learns to anticipate betrayal and internalizes a profound sense of worthlessness. When mistreated in adulthood, their internal compass does not sound an alarm. Instead, it registers the abuse as familiar, an inevitable confirmation of their own perceived toxicity, leading to a tragic failure to protest or flee. This distorted internal reality was vividly illustrated by a patient whose entire orientation to human connection had been warped by her past. She operated under the unwavering assumption that men were inherently callous and predatory, while women were weak, untrustworthy, and solely reliant on transactional survival. This profound cynicism covered every interaction. Kindness from colleagues was viewed with deep suspicion, and any deviation from rigid rules was met with harsh confrontation. At her core, she believed she was a fundamentally flawed human being, a poison that inevitably destroyed anyone who attempted to get close to her. Attempts to rationally challenge these deeply ingrained convictions often prove futile and can even exacerbate the patient's sense of isolation. When a well-meaning therapist tries to persuade an abuse survivor that they are not to blame for the atrocities committed against them, that a young child bears no responsibility for the transgressions of an adult, the rational intervention frequently misses the mark. The survivor has been conditioned to cater to the needs of dangerous adults, instinctively shouldering the blame for any misfortune as a desperate survival mechanism. When their deeply held, albeit irrational, guilt is contradicted by logic, it merely reinforces their agonizing conviction that no one in the world can possibly comprehend the depth of their psychological burden. The role of the healer, therefore, is not to argue with the patient's logic, but to patiently assist them in reconstructing their internal map of the world. These maps are not merely intellectual constructs. They are woven into the very neurobiology of the developing brain through thousands of early interactions. They define what is safe, who can be trusted, and what behaviors are necessary for survival. While these biological templates are remarkably enduring, they are not entirely immutable. Profound new experiences, a transformative adolescent romance, the birth of a child, or a deep spiritual awakening can reshape the neural landscape. Conversely, a healthy map can be shattered by a sudden catastrophic adult trauma, because these orientations are rooted deep within the emotional brain. Cognitive reframing is insufficient. True transformation requires descending into the visceral realm, learning to tolerate the agonizing physical sensations of humiliation and despair without being completely hijacked by them. Only by owning the physical reality of the emotional brain can the individual begin to befriend, rather than battle, the terrifying sensations that lock their worldview in place. The journey toward reclaiming this buried history often begins unexpectedly. In the safety of a therapeutic group, one member's courageous disclosure of a horrifying childhood violation can serve as a catalyst for others. Hearing the raw, unvarnished truth of another's suffering and witnessing the compassionate response of the group can shatter the walls of denial. For one woman, listening to a peer recount a brutal assault suddenly illuminated the dark, unacknowledged corners of her own past. Although she had chronically manifested the behaviors of a victim, her conscious mind had entirely suppressed the narrative of her abuse. Her body, her muscle tension, and her explosive defensive reactions had meticulously kept the score, but she possessed no conscious story to explain her suffering. The process of excavating these buried truths is fraught with terror. As therapeutic work commences, the individual is often besieged by waves of free-floating panic. The sensation of impending annihilation is so intense that simply breathing becomes a monumental challenge. The initial phase of healing must focus intensely on physical regulation, learning to anchor oneself in the present moment through rhythmic breathing and focused mindfulness. The patient must develop the capacity to observe their physical sensations without being instantly swallowed by the conviction that they are dying. As this somatic ownership solidifies, the boundary between past and present begins to clarify. A sudden touch in the dark ceases to be an immediate replay of childhood molestation and can be recognized as the benign presence of a current partner. When the protective barriers of amnesia finally yield, the memories that emerge are rarely coherent narratives. They return as fragmented, sensory flashbacks, the precise pattern of the childhood wallpaper, the terrifying sound of footsteps in the hall. The horror of parental betrayal is perhaps the most difficult reality a human mind can process. When a child is violated by the very person tasked with their protection, the betrayal is absolute. This agony is compounded when the other parent fails to intervene, offering only silence or blame. The child is left entirely bereft of sanctuary. The psychological weight of this abandonment forces the child to accommodate the abuse. They cannot flee, nor can they speak out, as doing so would risk the complete loss of their caregiving system. The only viable survival strategy is to silence themselves, to swallow the horror, and to fundamentally alter their perception of reality. To endure the unendurable, the child often resorts to profound dissociation. They learn to make themselves disappear. At the sound of the approaching abuser, their consciousness vacates their physical body, floating above the scene as a detached observer. They convince themselves that the atrocity is happening to someone else, effectively severing their connection to their own physical form. This dissociative reflex, forged in the crucible of childhood terror, often persists into adulthood. When confronted with intimacy or perceived threat, the adult instinctively vacates their body, leaving them numb, bewildered, and disconnected from their own physical and emotional reality. The tragedy of childhood trauma is that children must organize their entire existence around the adults who abuse or neglect them. They cannot comprehend that their parents' dysfunction is not their fault. Instead, they absorb the abuse as evidence of their own inherent badness. They direct their desperate energy towards suppressing the terror and panic coursing through their bodies. This enforced silence and self-blame breed a profound, inescapable loyalty to the abuser. The child's biological imperative to attach overrides all logic, leading to the heartbreaking reality that a tortured child will almost always choose to remain with an abusive family rather than face the terrifying unknown of separation. This paradoxical loyalty is the source of excruciating internal conflict, generating a silent, impotent rage that, finding no external target, turns viciously inward, manifesting as severe depression, self-mutilation, and chronic self-hatred. This internal warfare ensures that nothing in the survivor's world feels safe, least of all their own mind and body. The prospect of trusting another human being feels like an invitation to further devastation. The courage required to break the silence, to cross the threshold of a clinic and confess the unspeakable, is monumental. The survivor stands on the precipice, desperately needing help, yet viscerally convinced that exposure will only lead to further betrayal and pain. When a healer manages to convey genuine concern and understanding, it is often a revelation for the survivor, the first time they have ever felt worthy of another's worry. Yet, the trauma refuses to remain silent. It replays itself relentlessly in the theater of the night, Nightmares resurrect the exact, unadulterated sensations of the original horror, the feeling of being choked, the helplessness of suspension, the raw panic of impending death. These nocturnal assaults are so terrifying that survivors often wage a desperate war against sleep itself. In waking life, the trauma intrudes as sudden, violent physiological storms. A mundane action, like brushing one's teeth, can instantly precipitate a feeling of suffocating panic, a desperate, thrashing struggle for air that mirrors the physical reality of a past assault. These intrusive fragments demonstrate that traumatic memory is fundamentally different from ordinary recall. It is not a story from the past. It is a present tense physical and emotional re-experiencing of the terror. The fact that individuals endure these agonizing reenactments while simultaneously fighting to reclaim ownership of their lives is a testament to the astounding resilience of the human spirit. The path to healing requires confronting these fragmented horrors, not by arguing with them, but by painstakingly building the physiological and emotional capacity to tolerate the truth of the past while remaining safely anchored in the present. Chapter 9. What's love got to do with it? When evaluating the long-term devastation of childhood trauma, a profound and somewhat counterintuitive truth emerges from the clinical data. The specific nature of the abuse, the horrific details of the physical violence or the exact mechanics of the sexual exploitation, does not solely determine the severity of the psychological collapse in adulthood. Instead, the most critical variable, the factor that truly dictates whether a child's spirit is permanently shattered or retains a spark of resilience, is the presence or absence of a genuinely loving, protective caregiver. If a child endures unspeakable horrors but possesses at least one adult who offers unwavering affection, safe physical holding, and an undeniable sense of being cherished, the nervous system retains a vital lifeline. This solitary anchor of love provides a physiological refuge, mitigating the absolute despair and offering a template for future trust. However, when the trauma occurs in a vacuum of affection, when the abusers are the very parents tasked with providing love, or when a non-offending parent completely fails to intervene or offer solace, the devastation is absolute. The child's internal world becomes a barren wasteland, devoid of any biological memory of safety. The fundamental tragedy of these shattered lives is not just what was actively done to them, but what was profoundly withheld from them. The essential neurobiological nourishment of human connection. How do you take a trauma history? The standard psychiatric evaluation is woefully ill-equipped to uncover the realities of a shattered childhood. The conventional medical model relies on a rigid checklist of symptoms, inquiries about sleep disturbances, fluctuating moods, difficulties with concentration, and aggressive impulses. While this inventory meticulously documents the superficial manifestations of distress, it completely ignores the underlying context. It asks, "What is wrong with you?" while actively avoiding the infinitely more vital question, "What happened to you?" For a traumatized individual, this superficial interrogation feels profoundly alienating. They are already burdened by an agonizing shame regarding their past, fundamentally convinced that their experiences reflect their own inherent depravity. They will not voluntarily offer a detailed account of their deepest humiliations to a stranger wielding a clipboard and a list of diagnostic criteria. The process of gathering a true history requires immense patience, profound empathy, and a deliberate departure from the rigid medical script. The clinician must slowly build a container of safety, recognizing that the most agonizing truths are often hidden behind a fortress of amnesia, defensive hostility, or profound dissociation. Uncovering the history of trauma is not an administrative task. It is a delicate, archaeological excavation of a buried, terrified soul. Self-harm. One of the most bewildering and deeply misunderstood manifestations of this unbearable internal pressure is the deliberate destruction of one's own flesh. To the outside observer, the act of taking a razor to one's own arms or legs appears as absolute madness, an incomprehensible violation of the biological imperative to avoid pain. Yet, within the warped physiological landscape of profound trauma, self-mutilation possesses a chilling, desperate logic. When an individual is entirely overwhelmed by a chaotic storm of emotional agony, a tsunami of shame, terror and relentless self-hatred, the sheer volume of internal pain becomes intolerable. Inflicting a sharp, concentrated physical wound serves as a powerful distraction, violently pulling the focus away from the unmanageable emotional chaos and grounding it in a highly specific, localized physical sensation. Furthermore, this deliberate injury forces the brain to unleash a massive surge of endogenous opioids, the body's natural painkillers. This sudden chemical flood provides an immediate, albeit temporary, wave of profound relief and emotional numbing. Alternatively, for those who exist in a chronic state of terrifying dissociation and bodily numbness, the sharp sting of a blade and the sight of their own blood offers undeniable proof that they are still alive. It is a tragic biological attempt at self-soothing and survival, enacted by a nervous system that has been stripped of all healthy mechanisms for regulating despair. The power of diagnosis. The language we use to categorize human suffering wields an immense, often destructive power. In the realm of mental health, a diagnostic label is not merely a descriptive shorthand, it dictates the entire trajectory of an individual's treatment and, tragically, frequently defines their own perception of their fundamental identity. When a profoundly traumatized adolescent, exhibiting explosive rage born of chronic childhood terror, is rigidly labeled with oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, the clinical focus instantly shifts. The context of the horrific environment that necessitated those survival behaviors is entirely erased. The child is no longer viewed as a terrified victim reacting logically to an unsafe world. Instead, they are pathologized as inherently defective, an aggressive problem to be managed and chemically subdued. Similarly, adults burdened by the chaotic emotional fluctuations of severe, unresolved early trauma are routinely misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder. Once these heavy clinical labels are permanently attached to a patient's medical record, the overarching goal of therapy devolves into mere symptom management. The intricate, agonizing narrative of their survival is discarded in favor of rigid protocols and heavy pharmacological interventions designed to suppress the very behaviors that once kept them alive, effectively condemning them to a lifetime of chemical restraint without ever offering the possibility of true foundational healing. The DSM-5, a veritable smorgasbord of diagnoses. The primary manual guiding the psychiatric profession has evolved into a sprawling, fragmented catalogue of human misery, utterly failing to capture the cohesive reality of a traumatized life. The current diagnostic framework slices the profound systemic devastation of severe childhood trauma into dozens of discrete, seemingly unrelated disorders. A single traumatized child might accumulate a bewildering array of distinct labels: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder to explain their hypervigilance and inability to focus, major depressive disorder to account for their profound emotional collapse, separation anxiety to describe their terrified clinging, and oppositional defiant disorder to categorize their desperate reactive rage. This piecemeal approach to diagnosis is not merely inaccurate, it is fundamentally absurd. It treats these symptoms as independent diseases striking randomly, completely ignoring the fact that they are all interconnected manifestations of a single, unified phenomenon, a developing nervous system desperately attempting to survive an environment devoid of safety and love. By forcefully fitting the square peg of developmental trauma into the round holes of these disjointed categories, the psychiatric establishment effectively blinds itself to the root cause of the suffering. This systemic failure ensures that heavily traumatized individuals receive a chaotic cocktail of treatments aimed at suppressing individual symptoms, while the underlying shattered foundation, the desperate need for safety, somatic regulation, and secure human connection, remains entirely ignored and unhealed. Chapter 10. Developmental Trauma, the Hidden Epidemic. The monumental failure of the psychiatric establishment to accurately categorize the profound suffering of traumatized children is not merely an academic oversight. It is a systemic crisis with devastating real-world consequences. When a child's entire developmental trajectory has been warped by chronic abuse, neglect, or exposure to domestic violence, their resulting symptoms do not fit neatly into the isolated, rigid boxes of the traditional diagnostic manual. Instead, their suffering is pervasive and systemic. Their nervous systems are perpetually disorganized, their capacity to trust is shattered, Their ability to regulate their emotions is virtually non-existent, and their fundamental sense of self is deeply fragmented. Yet because the medical model demands a specific label for every distinct symptom, these children are routinely burdened with a chaotic amalgamation of diagnoses. A single, deeply traumatized child might be simultaneously labeled with severe anxiety, depressive disorders, oppositional defiance, and attention deficits. This disjointed approach entirely obscures the unifying root cause of their struggles, an environment devoid of the safety and attuned caregiving necessary for healthy brain development. Driven by the urgent need to rectify this dangerous clinical blind spot, a collaborative effort was launched alongside dedicated colleagues from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. The objective was to synthesize decades of rigorous clinical observation and neurobiological research into a comprehensive, unified framework. We proposed a new diagnostic category: developmental trauma disorder. This proposed diagnosis aimed to capture the full, complex reality of children who had survived chronic interpersonal trauma. It recognized that when the caregiving system, the very mechanism designed by evolution to protect and regulate a child, becomes a source of terror or profound abandonment, the child's entire biological and psychological scaffolding is compromised. The developmental trauma disorder framework explicitly linked the child's chaotic behaviors, severe emotional dysregulation, and profound learning difficulties directly to their history of chronic victimization and disrupted attachment. The introduction of developmental trauma disorder was intended to radically transform the landscape of child psychiatry. By acknowledging the root cause of the suffering, clinicians would be guided away from the reflexive urge to chemically subdue bad behavior and toward interventions that actively address the underlying developmental derailments. If a child's explosive rage or profound dissociation is understood as a desperate survival strategy forged in a terrifying environment, the therapeutic focus shifts. The primary goal becomes the painstaking restoration of physiological safety and the rebuilding of secure, reciprocal human connections. The new diagnosis offered a compassionate, scientifically grounded roadmap for treatment, emphasizing that healing requires engaging the child's entire organism, body, mind, and brain, in a coordinated effort to restore the fundamental rhythms of trust and regulation that were stolen from them. To validate this new diagnostic framework, an extensive field trial was meticulously organized. Data was gathered from thousands of children across a wide spectrum of clinical settings, including specialized trauma centers, the foster care system, and juvenile justice facilities. The clinical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The children in these systems consistently exhibited a complex constellation of symptoms that perfectly aligned with the proposed criteria for developmental trauma disorder. Their struggles with chronic hyperarousal, profound emotional numbing, severe aggressive outbursts, and an inability to sustain focused attention were clearly interconnected manifestations of their traumatic pasts, not a random assortment of genetic biochemical malfunctions. The data provided robust empirical proof that the existing diagnostic categories were woefully inadequate for describing, let alone treating, the hidden epidemic of childhood trauma. Despite the sheer weight of the clinical data and the impassioned advocacy of leading trauma experts worldwide, the proposal encountered formidable entrenched resistance from the architects of the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual. The prevailing institutional bias heavily favored the established symptom-focused approach, fiercely protecting the existing boundaries of discrete disorders. The proposition that a massive array of psychiatric symptoms could be traced back to a single, unifying environmental cause, chronic developmental trauma, threatened to upend the established pharmacological and diagnostic paradigms. Ultimately, in a decision that prioritized bureaucratic inertia over clinical reality, developmental trauma disorder was rejected for inclusion in the updated manual. This rejection represented a tragic, monumental missed opportunity for the field of mental health. By refusing to officially recognize the comprehensive devastation of early interpersonal trauma, the psychiatric establishment effectively condemned countless vulnerable children to a continued cycle of misdiagnosis and misguided treatment. Without a unifying diagnosis that acknowledges their history, these children remain at the mercy of a system that views them as a collection of behavioral problems to be managed, rather than as deeply wounded individuals in desperate need of holistic healing. They continue to be heavily medicated with powerful antipsychotics and stimulants that only mask their underlying terror, while the essential foundational foundational work of rebuilding their shattered sense of safety and capacity for human connection is tragically ignored. The battle for recognition, however, is far from over. The clinical reality of developmental trauma disorder remains an undeniable truth in the therapy rooms, classrooms, and juvenile halls across the nation. The sheer magnitude of the hidden epidemic of childhood trauma demands that we look beyond the limitations of official diagnostic manuals. True healing requires a profound paradigm shift, a collective commitment to asking not simply what is wrong with a child, but what happened to them. Only by courageously acknowledging the pervasive impact of early trauma can we begin to implement the deeply attuned, body-based, and relationally focused interventions that possess the power to truly alter the trajectory of these shattered lives and guide them toward genuine recovery and resilience. Chapter 11: Uncovering Secrets. The Problem of Traumatic Memory. The human mind possesses a terrifying, magnificent capacity to hide from its own reality. When an individual is confronted with an experience that completely shatters their understanding of the world, an event so horrific, violent, or profoundly humiliating that integrating it into conscious thought would cause the ego to disintegrate, the mind instinctively acts to quarantine the experience. This desperate act of psychological preservation relies on burying the truth, rendering the horrific event a deeply guarded secret even from the victim themselves. Yet the eradication of a memory from conscious awareness does not equate to the eradication of its impact. The unspoken, unacknowledged remnants of horror do not simply evaporate, they fester in the dark. They mutate into an invisible architecture that dictates the survivor's physiology, their emotional responses, and their deepest interpersonal relationships. The fundamental problem of traumatic memory is that it refuses to remain entirely buried. It leaks out through the cracks of consciousness, manifesting as terrifying nightmares, inexplicable physical agony, and sudden, explosive behavioral reactions that leave both the survivor and their loved ones utterly bewildered. To understand how these invisible wounds shape a life, one must recognize that ordinary memory and traumatic memory operate on fundamentally different biological and psychological planes. Ordinary narrative memory is a dynamic, evolving story. When we recall a past vacation or a childhood milestone, the memory is fluid. It changes slightly with each retelling, colored by our present circumstances and our ongoing psychological development. It is an event that belongs firmly to the past, integrated into the continuous, cohesive timeline of our lives. Traumatic memory, conversely, is entirely devoid of this temporal flexibility. It is not a story that is remembered. It is an agonizing reality that is viscerally relived. It exists in a suspended state of sensory fragments, the precise smell of an attacker's cologne, the exact blinding angle of the sunlight during a car crash, the specific pitch of a terrified scream. Because these fragments were never processed into a coherent autobiographical narrative, the brain's internal timekeeper cannot recognize that the event has ended. Whenever these sensory fragments are triggered by a seemingly innocuous environmental cue, the survivor is instantly plunged back into the exact physiological terror of the original event. Amnesia, dissociation, and reenactment. The mechanism by which the mind achieves this fragmented quarantine is a profound psychological splitting known as dissociation. In the midst of unbearable agony, when physical escape is impossible, the consciousness violently detaches from the physical body. The mind observes the atrocity from a distant, anesthetized vantage point, effectively concluding that the horror is happening to someone else, or perhaps not happening at all. This immediate, life-saving separation protects the core self from immediate annihilation. However, when the external threat eventually ceases, this dissociative reflex frequently fails to deactivate. It becomes an ingrained, automatic response to any subsequent stress or intimacy. The survivor learns to chronically vacate their own existence, resulting in a life characterized by profound emotional numbness and a terrifying sense of unreality. This chronic dissociation is the primary architect of trauma-induced amnesia. Because the conscious mind was forcefully separated from the physical experience while it was occurring, the brain fails to encode a cohesive, accessible memory of the event. The survivor may possess vast, chilling blank spots in their personal history, entire years of childhood that yield nothing but an impenetrable void. They may function with high intellectual capacity in their professional lives while remaining completely oblivious to the horrific betrayals that forged their underlying psychological fragility. Yet, the body maintains a meticulous, uncompromising muscles remember the bracing for impact. The nervous system remembers the paralyzing terror. When the conscious narrative is erased but the physical imprint remains, the trauma inevitably demands expression through behavioral reenactment. Driven by a desperate, unconscious biological imperative to finally master the unmasterable event, survivors frequently find themselves compulsively drawn to situations, relationships, or behaviors that replicate the exact dynamics of their original abuse. A woman who was profoundly neglected and battered in childhood may repeatedly, almost magnetically, attach herself to violent partners. A veteran who survived the chaotic adrenaline of a war zone may engage in reckless, high-speed driving or substance abuse to chemically recreate the intense physiological arousal of combat. These reenactments are rarely recognized by the individual as echoes of the past. They feel like immediate, vital compulsions. The survivor is trapped in a tragic, invisible loop, perpetually acting out the unremembered secret, desperately trying to change the ending of a script they do not even realize they are following. The origins of the talking cure. The realization that physical suffering and erratic behavior could be the direct manifestations of buried, unintegrated memories is not a modern revelation. The conceptual foundation for understanding traumatic memory was laid over a century ago in the clinical theaters of late 19th century Europe. In Paris, at the renowned Salpêtrière Hospital, the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot began meticulously documenting the bizarre physical afflictions of his patients. These individuals, predominantly women, suffered from profound maladies that defied all known anatomical logic, paralyses that did not follow neural pathways, sudden sensory blindness, and dramatic full-body convulsions. Charcot termed this bewildering condition hysteria and demonstrated, much to the astonishment of the medical establishment, that these physical symptoms could be temporarily alleviated or even induced through the use of hypnosis. It was Charcot's brilliant student, Pierre Janet, who truly revolutionized the understanding of these invisible wounds. Janet observed that his hysterical patients were not suffering from neurological decay, but from a profound psychological fragmentation. He posited that when an individual experiences a vehement emotion that overpowers their capacity to process it, the memory of that event is split off from normal consciousness. It becomes a subconscious, autonomous entity that continues to exert a terrifying influence over the body and the mind. Janet recognized that these fragmented memories were the true source of the unexplained paralyses and terrors. He understood that until the fragmented memory was brought into conscious awareness, assimilated into the patient's personal history, and stripped of its overwhelming emotional charge, the physical symptoms would persist. Concurrently, in Vienna, a young physician named Sigmund Freud, heavily influenced by his time observing Charcot in Paris, was developing his own revolutionary theories alongside his colleague Joseph Breuer. Through their meticulous work with traumatized patients, they arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion. The physical agony of hysteria was the direct result of a suppressed, highly emotional memory that had been denied expression. Freud and Breuer famously declared that hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. They hypothesized that if the patient could be gently guided to recall the buried trauma and simultaneously express the intense, strangled emotion associated with it, a process they termed catharsis, the physical symptoms would permanently vanish. This early, profound collaboration birthed the foundational concept of the talking cure. The revolutionary proposition was that language itself, when tethered to the raw emotion of a buried memory, possessed the power to physically heal. By translating the chaotic, terrifying sensory fragments of the past into a cohesive spoken narrative, the unbearable secret was finally dragged into the light of shared human consciousness. The isolation of the trauma was broken. The brain could finally contextualize the horror, moving it from a state of perpetual, agonizing, present-tense reliving into the finite, manageable realm of historical memory. While the modern understanding of neuroscience has vastly expanded our comprehension of exactly how the brain and body process terror, this foundational insight that the unacknowledged past dictates the suffering of the present, and that integration is the only path to liberation, remains the bedrock upon which all true recovery must be built. Chapter 12. The Unbearable Heaviness of Remembering. The scientific community's engagement with the psychological aftermath of overwhelming terror has never been a steady progression of accumulating knowledge. Instead, it has been characterized by dramatic fluctuations, periods of intense curiosity, followed by eras of profound, almost deliberate amnesia. At the close of the 19th century, the meticulous investigations into hysteria by pioneers in Paris and Vienna brought the devastating physical and emotional consequences of trauma into the light of medical scrutiny. Yet, this intense focus was agonizingly brief. Within a few short years, the prevailing psychological paradigms shifted away from external violations to prioritize internal, unconscious conflicts. The reality of trauma as the primary architect of psychological suffering was largely abandoned, leaving those who studied its effects feeling marginalized and ignored by the broader medical establishment. This period of intellectual neglect was violently interrupted by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The unprecedented scale of industrialized slaughter on the battlefields of Europe generated a tidal wave of psychological casualties that could not be hidden. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers returned from the trenches exhibiting inexplicable physical paralyses, terrifying facial tics, mutism, and severe memory loss. These were not the manifestations of cowardice, but the raw, unmediated physical expressions of minds shattered by unimaginable horror. The British military initially acknowledged this reality with the diagnosis of shell shock, a label that legitimized the soldiers' suffering and entitled them to medical care and pensions. However, as the war dragged on and the casualty lists swelled to unsustainable numbers, the sheer volume of psychologically devastated men began to threaten the efficiency of the fighting forces. The military establishment, prioritizing victory over the care of its soldiers, initiated a systematic campaign of denial. High-ranking commanders, utterly disconnected from the brutal reality of the trenches, issued draconian orders forbidding the use of the term shell shock in any official medical or casualty reports. Soldiers breaking down under the relentless barrage of artillery were increasingly viewed not as psychiatric casualties, but as malingerers lacking moral fortitude and discipline. Following the war, official government reports further cemented this denial, insisting that psychological collapse should never be classified as a legitimate battle casualty. The objective was to eliminate the diagnosis from official nomenclature, thereby preventing future claims for compensation and absolving the state of its responsibility to its broken veterans. This institutionalized cruelty was mirrored globally, with some nations resorting to punitive measures, such as the use of painful electroshock to force so-called weak soldiers back into compliance. The consequences of this societal refusal to acknowledge the true cost of war were catastrophic. When a society turns a blind eye to the profound wounds inflicted upon its protectors, it undermines its own moral fabric. In the United States, the desperation of forgotten veterans culminated in 1932 during the depths of the Great Depression, when thousands of impoverished World War I veterans camped in the capital to demand their promised compensation. Their desperate petition was met with military force as heavily armed troops and tanks drove them from their encampments with tear gas and bayonets. Across the Atlantic, the denial of trauma fueled even darker political forces. Literature that accurately depicted the soul-crushing reality of combat, which resonated deeply with a generation of shattered men, was swiftly banned and burned by rising totalitarian regimes. The refusal to tolerate weakness and the ruthless mistreatment of traumatized veterans became foundational elements in the rise of militaristic and fascist ideologies that eventually plunged the world into an even more devastating global conflict. The sheer magnitude of the Second World War forced a renewed, albeit temporary, medical engagement with the realities of combat trauma. Military psychiatrists, tasked with returning broken men to the front lines, experimented with treatments that acknowledged the buried horror of their experiences. Documentary footage from the era reveals soldiers undergoing hypnosis, a technique that temporarily bypassed their conscious defenses and allowed them to articulate the unspeakable terrors, the survivor's guilt, and the agonizing loyalties that were tearing them apart from the inside. Yet, despite these clinical advancements and the subsequent creation of robust social programs to reintegrate veterans into post-war society, the specific psychological diagnosis of war neurosis was, once again, quietly erased from the official psychiatric manuals. The veterans themselves, encouraged by a culture eager to move on, largely internalized their suffering, expressing their unresolved traumas through chronic physical ailments, stomach ulcers, and cardiovascular distress rather than through vocalized despair. It was not until the aftermath of the Vietnam War that the agonizing reality of psychological trauma firmly re-established itself within the medical lexicon. The relentless advocacy of veterans, combined with the undeniable evidence of their suffering, forced the psychiatric establishment to formally recognize the constellation of symptoms that would become known as post-traumatic stress. Concurrently, this era witnessed a profound cultural awakening regarding the prevalence of violence within the domestic sphere. A burgeoning social movement shattered the silence surrounding the hidden epidemics of rape, domestic battering, and childhood sexual abuse. Textbooks that had previously dismissed incest as a statistical rarity, or grotesquely suggested it might even be beneficial, were exposed as dangerously ignorant. Thousands of survivors found the courage to speak the truth about their betrayals, creating a powerful momentum for recovery and therapeutic innovation. Predictably, this surge in awareness provoked a fierce and highly organized backlash. By the early 1990s, a narrative emerged in the media and legal arenas suggesting that the epidemic of abuse was largely a fabrication. The concept of false memory syndrome gained traction, positing that well-meaning but misguided therapists were actively implanting fictitious memories of childhood horror into the minds of highly suggestible patients. The foundation of this backlash rested on the assertion that the human mind is incapable of completely repressing the memory of a profound trauma, and that any delayed recall must inherently be viewed with extreme suspicion. This perspective found eager champions in institutions defending themselves against allegations of systemic abuse, leading to bitter courtroom battles where the very nature of human memory was put on trial. However, the assertion that severe trauma cannot be forgotten stands in stark contradiction to over a century of rigorous clinical observation and scientific research. The phenomenon of profound memory loss following catastrophic events, from natural disasters and military evacuations to torture and childhood sexual exploitation, has been consistently documented by researchers across generations. The mechanism by which the mind protects itself from total annihilation by quarantining the unbearable reality of the event is a well-established biological and psychological defense. The reality of traumatic amnesia and the subsequent accuracy of recovered memories was definitively illuminated by groundbreaking longitudinal research. In a landmark study, researchers tracked down over 100 women who, as young girls, had been treated in a hospital emergency room for documented sexual abuse. When interviewed nearly 2 decades later, a staggering percentage of these women possessed absolutely no conscious recollection of the very abuse that had prompted their emergency medical care. The study further revealed that women who had been younger at the time of the violation, or who had been assaulted by someone they knew and trusted, were the most likely to have completely banished the event from their conscious minds. Crucially, the research also examined those women who had experienced a period of profound amnesia but had later recovered the memories of their abuse. When their recovered narratives were compared against their original, contemporaneous medical records, the core facts of the trauma were found to be highly accurate. While the peripheral details might have blurred with the passage of time, the central truth of their victimization remained intact, proving that a memory temporarily lost to the protective mechanisms of dissociation is not a memory destroyed, nor is its eventual return an illusion. The mind's desperate attempt to survive the unbearable heaviness of the past does not erase the truth. It merely delays the inevitable reckoning. Chapter 13. Healing from Trauma. Owning Yourself. The ultimate objective of any therapeutic endeavor is to guide the individual toward reclaiming sovereignty over their own existence. For those who have endured the shattering impact of trauma, the world has fundamentally altered its shape, transforming from a landscape of potential into an active minefield of hidden threats. The very vessel of their existence, their physical body and their conscious mind, has been hijacked by the echoes of a past terror. To heal is not merely to successfully manage an inventory of agonizing symptoms, nor is it simply a matter of learning to suppress the sudden, violent surges of panic or the crushing weights of depression. True recovery is a profound, holistic reclamation. It requires an individual to become the undisputed author of their own life once more, safely inhabiting their own skin and possessing the capacity to fully engage with the present moment without being violently pulled backward into the abyss of history. This monumental task of ownership requires a multifaceted approach to the human organism. The individual must first discover a way to achieve a state of physical and emotional calm, establishing a stable stable foundation from which to navigate the world. They must also develop the capacity to sustain their attention, to remain anchored in the immediate reality, rather than being continuously swept away by intrusive memories or dissociative voids. Furthermore, true ownership necessitates a deliberate, courageous engagement with the physical self, a willingness to remain present and attuned to the subtle, continuous stream of bodily sensations, even when those sensations carry the heavy residue of past agonies. Finally, an essential component of this reclamation is the restoration of interpersonal connection, the ability to interact with others with genuine presence and honesty, without the pervasive shield of defensive secrecy or the paralyzing fear of inevitable betrayal. Listening to survivors. The traditional medical and psychiatric establishments have frequently positioned themselves as the ultimate authorities on the mechanics of human suffering and the protocols for its alleviation. Yet, a truly profound understanding of what constitutes meaningful recovery rarely originates from the sterile confines of a laboratory or the rigid pages of a diagnostic manual. The most illuminating and transformative insights consistently emerge from the brave, unvarnished testimonies of the survivors themselves. When clinicians set aside their preconceived theoretical frameworks and genuinely listen to the lived experiences of those who have navigated the darkest corridors of psychological injury, a radically different map of healing is revealed. Survivors consistently report that their most significant breakthroughs did not occur through intellectual epiphanies or the mere adjustment of neurochemical balances via medication. Instead, they speak of the vital importance of somatic grounding, the profound relief of finding safe, non-judgmental human connection, and the transformative power of engaging in rhythmic, deeply embodied practices. They describe the necessity of finding environments where their shattered nervous systems are not pathologized, but understood as heroic adaptations to an unendurable reality. By deeply attuning to these voices, it becomes unequivocally clear that the path to recovery must encompass the entirety of the human experience, honoring the intricate, undeniable bond between the physical body, the emotional brain, and the conscious mind. Nancy's story. Consider the profound journey of a woman who spent the majority of her adult life navigating a labyrinth of psychiatric interventions that entirely failed to touch the core of her suffering. For decades, her existence was defined by a chaotic oscillation between paralyzing, suicidal depressions and frantic, self-destructive impulses. She had been subjected to an exhaustive array of chemical treatments and traditional psychoanalytic therapies, yet the fundamental terror that gripped her nervous system remained unabated. She carried the heavy, suffocating burden of a childhood marred by severe, unspeakable violations, though her conscious mind had largely fragmented these experiences into chaotic, unmanageable physiological storms rather than a coherent narrative. Her turning point did not arrive in the form of a sudden psychological insight, but through a radical shift in how she approached her own physical being. Exhausted by the endless circular discussions of her past, she tentatively engaged in therapeutic modalities that bypassed the linguistic centers of her brain and directly addressed the silent, terrified animal of her physical body. Through careful, guided practices of somatic awareness and mindful movement, she slowly began to decipher the agonizing language of her own muscles and viscera. She learned to notice the exact moment her breathing would shallow in response to an invisible trigger, and she developed the monumental courage to simply stay with that sensation, observing it without immediately fleeing into dissociation or self-harm. This painstaking, deeply physical work allowed her to finally differentiate the raw, historical terror trapped in her nervous system from the actual, present-tense reality of her current life. By learning to tolerate the physical sensations of her own body, she gradually dismantled the invisible prison of her past. She did not erase the agonizing history she had endured, but she fundamentally altered her relationship to it, stripping the traumatic memories of their power to command her present actions and successfully reclaiming the territory of her own flesh. The miracle of self-discovery. Beneath the chaotic, terrifying debris of severe psychological injury, there exists a fundamental, uncorrupted core of the human being. The profound tragedy of trauma is that it buries this essential self under thick, impenetrable layers of defensive armor, reactive rage, and paralyzing shame. The individual becomes so completely identified with their survival strategies, the hypervigilance, the numbing, the desperate attempts to control their environment, that they entirely lose sight of their own intrinsic value and inner stillness. They come to believe that they are nothing more than the sum of their shattered fragments and their unbearable pain. The heart of the healing process is the meticulous, compassionate excavation of this buried core. It is the realization that the self is not inherently broken, but merely obscured. Through practices that cultivate deep, non-judgmental observation, such as focused mindfulness, an individual learns to step back and witness the turbulent storms of their own mind without being consumed by them. They develop the capacity to notice the sudden flare of panic or the heavy pull of despair, and recognize these states as transient, historical echoes rather than permanent definitions of their identity. This separation of the observing self from the traumatic reaction is nothing short of miraculous. It replaces the harsh, relentless internal critic with a profound, quiet self-compassion, allowing the individual to finally offer themselves the care and understanding that was brutally withheld from them in the past. The limits of language. We are a species fundamentally defined by our capacity for language. We rely on narratives to structure our understanding of the world, to forge connections with one another, and to make sense of the chaotic sequence of our lives. Because of this profound reliance on words, the default assumption in the realm of mental health has long been that healing must be achieved through dialogue. The talking cure posits that if an individual can simply articulate the exact nature of their suffering, construct a logical narrative of their past, and achieve intellectual insight into their current behaviors, the trauma will be resolved. However, severe psychological injury frequently resides in a realm that words cannot penetrate. As neuroimaging has starkly revealed, the sheer magnitude of a traumatic event actively shuts down the brain's linguistic centers. The horror is encoded not as a cohesive story, but as raw, fragmented sensory data locked deep within the primitive emotional and survival structures of the brain. When an individual is triggered, their rational, linguistic mind goes offline, leaving them completely at the mercy of visceral panic and physiological chaos. In these moments, attempting to reason with the terrified nervous system is an exercise in futility. A cognitive understanding that the danger has passed is entirely insufficient to quell a biological alarm system that perceives an immediate mortal threat. While the ability to eventually construct a coherent narrative of one's past is a vital milestone in recovery, it is rarely the starting point. The profound limitations of language demand that we expand our therapeutic horizons. We must recognize that the most direct route to the inflamed emotional brain is through the body itself. Healing necessitates interventions that utilize movement, rhythm, breath, and touch to communicate a visceral sense of safety to the organism, effectively soothing the silent, pre-verbal terror that logic alone can never reach. Chapter 14. Language, Miracle, and Tyranny. The ability to communicate complex thoughts and forge shared realities through words is one of the defining triumphs of human evolution. Language allows individuals to bridge the agonizing gap of isolation, to construct a cohesive narrative of their existence, and to make themselves known to others. When an individual can accurately articulate their internal state, when they can say, "I am terrified," or "I am furiously angry," they take the first crucial step toward mastering that emotion. The physical act of translating a visceral feeling into a symbolic word engages the higher cortical regions of the brain, applying a necessary break to the frantic firing of the limbic system. It allows us to step outside of our immediate physical reactions and gain a vital measure of objective distance from our own suffering. Yet, the very mechanism that serves as our primary tool for connection becomes uniquely tyrannical in the aftermath of profound psychological injury. Trauma, by its very nature, pushes the human organism beyond the boundaries of language. The sheer, overwhelming terror of a catastrophic event actively disables the linguistic centers of the brain, specifically Broca's area, rendering the victim physically incapable of translating their experience into organized speech. The horror is not recorded as a logical sequence of events with a clear beginning, middle, and end, but rather as a chaotic storm of raw sensory fragments and agonizing physical sensations. Consequently, when survivors later attempt to speak of their experiences, they frequently find themselves confronted by an impenetrable wall of silence. Words feel utterly inadequate, fragile constructs entirely incapable of bearing the crushing weight of their internal devastation. This linguistic paralysis creates a devastating paradox in traditional therapeutic settings. The prevailing assumption that healing can only be achieved through rational dialogue places an impossible burden on the traumatized individual. To demand that a survivor construct a coherent narrative of an event that fundamentally shattered their capacity for speech is to invite further failure and agonizing shame. Furthermore, when survivors do manage to force themselves to speak about their trauma, they often do so from a state of profound emotional detachment. They recite the horrific facts of their violation with a chilling, robotic precision that entirely bypasses the emotional reality of the event. This sterile recounting does not facilitate integration or relief. It merely reinforces the profound dissociative divide between their conscious mind and their terrified physical body. If spoken language frequently fails to bridge this divide, alternative avenues of expression must be explored to break the isolation. The profound power of the written word offers a vital sanctuary. When an individual engages in expressive writing, entirely free from the agonizing scrutiny of an audience or the immediate pressure of a conversational response, a different neurological pathway is activated. The act of writing allows the survivor to externalize the chaotic fragments of their suffering onto a physical page, granting them a degree of separation and control. By slowly, painstakingly translating the raw, silent terror into a visible, tangible form, they begin the arduous process of weaving the isolated, fragmented memories of trauma back into the continuous fabric of their life's narrative. Chapter 15. Letting Go of the Past, EMDR. The landscape of trauma recovery was fundamentally altered by a serendipitous observation that occurred far outside the walls of any clinical laboratory. It began with a simple walk through a park, during which a researcher named Francine Shapiro noticed that the highly disturbing thoughts clouding her mind spontaneously dissipated as her eyes darted rapidly back and forth, tracking the shifting shadows and sunlight through the trees. This seemingly mundane realization sparked a relentless inquiry into the relationship between bilateral sensory stimulation and the brain's capacity to process distressing memories, culminating in the development of eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR. The introduction of this unconventional modality was initially met with fierce institutional skepticism. The prevailing psychiatric establishment, deeply entrenched in the paradigms of prolonged exposure and cognitive behavioral therapies, viewed the rapid rhythmic eye movements as a bizarre, unscientific gimmick. The proposition that a patient could resolve decades of entrenched post-traumatic stress without enduring grueling hours of agonizing verbal recounting seemed utterly implausible to those heavily invested in the talking cure. Yet the clinical results emerging from the therapy rooms were undeniable and frequently astounding. Individuals who had spent years paralyzed by intrusive nightmares and debilitating flashbacks were experiencing profound, lasting relief after only a handful of sessions. The true efficacy of EMDR lies in its unique ability to bypass the rational linguistic centers of the brain and directly engage the deeply rooted, fragmented neural networks where traumatic memories stubbornly reside. When a patient actively holds a terrifying traumatic image in their mind while simultaneously tracking the therapist's moving fingers, the bilateral stimulation appears to jumpstart the brain's innate stored information processing system. It closely mimics the neurological activity of REM sleep, a biological state naturally designed to integrate and make sense of the day's experiences. The rapid eye movements, or alternating auditory tones, distract the brain's conscious mechanism just enough to prevent the amygdala from instantly sounding the alarm, allowing the individual to remain securely grounded in the present moment, while the historical horror is safely observed and metabolized. During this accelerated processing, the painful memories are not magically erased, but their overwhelming emotional charge is fundamentally neutralized. The isolated fragments of the trauma, the terrifying sounds, the phantom physical pains, the paralyzing beliefs of absolute worthlessness are finally connected to the brain's wider adaptive networks. A patient who previously felt viscerally responsible for a childhood assault might suddenly, without any logical prompting or debate from the therapist, arrive at the unshakable embodied realization that they were merely a helpless child and entirely blameless. The trauma is successfully integrated, transformed from an eternal, terrifying present into a definitive, closed chapter of the past. 16. Learning to inhabit your body. Yoga. For those bearing the invisible, heavy scars of severe psychological injury, the physical body ceases to be a safe haven. It transforms into a treacherous, unpredictable landscape rigged with the explosive tripwires of hyperarousal and the suffocating numbness of profound dissociation. Because the body continues to harbor the agonizing physiological responses of past terrors, the rapid heartbeat, the shallow breath, the chronic muscular bracing, survivors learn to systematically ignore the sensory information ascending from their own flesh. This deliberate, desperate severance protects them from the unendurable pain of the past, but it simultaneously cuts them off from the vital currents of physical vitality, spontaneous joy, and the fundamental biological sense of being truly alive. Reclaiming this lost territory requires an intervention that speaks the silent, visceral language of the body. The ancient, deliberate practice of yoga provides a profoundly effective bridge back to the physical self. Unlike vigorous physical exercise, which often relies on distraction and adrenaline to push past discomfort, trauma-sensitive yoga demands an acute, sustained, and gentle focus on the internal experience. It invites the individual to intentionally notice the continuous fluctuations of their breath, the subtle shifts in muscular tension, and the precise alignment of their posture. This deliberate inward attention, known as interoception, is the precise neurological function that severe trauma actively dismantles. The integration of yoga into clinical trauma treatment fundamentally shifts the therapeutic objective. The goal is not intellectual insight or narrative coherence, but profound physiological ownership. As a survivor moves through a carefully structured sequence of physical postures, they inevitably encounter the locked, rigid areas of their body where the physical memory of trauma is fiercely held. They may experience sudden, terrifying surges of panic or profound waves of unexpected grief rising to the surface. The practice teaches them to approach these intense sensations not with the habitual instinct to flee, fight, or dissociate, but with steady, non-judgmental curiosity. By utilizing the slow, rhythmic regulation of their breath, they learn to actively pacify their own nervous system in the midst of internal distress. This continuous cycle of encountering physical discomfort, remaining deeply present in the moment, and consciously returning to a state of calm rewires the deeply ingrained biological expectations of the traumatized brain. The individual learns on a visceral level that a sudden spike in heart rate or a sensation of tightness in the chest is not an inevitable harbinger of imminent annihilation. They discover that all sensations, no matter how intense, eventually crest and recede. Through this patient, profoundly embodied work, the frozen, defensive postures of the past gently thaw. The capacity for physical pleasure, deep rest, and genuine relaxation is painstakingly restored. By learning to safely and confidently inhabit their own skin, survivors finally rebuild the indispensable biological foundation necessary to fully re-engage with the vibrant, demanding reality of the present world. Chapter 17. Putting the pieces together. Self-leadership. Early in the journey of treating deep psychological wounds, one might encounter individuals whose minds have splintered so dramatically that distinct personas emerge to interact with the world. A young woman, seemingly timid and physically collapsed, might suddenly present herself in a subsequent session with an entirely different posture, voice, and attitude, claiming a different name and warning the therapist not to trust the previous persona. While such dramatic presentations of dissociative identity disorder represent the furthest edge of psychological fragmentation, the underlying mechanism is a universal human trait. The sensation of harboring conflicting impulses, of feeling inhabited by warring factions, is an experience familiar to everyone. For those who have endured overwhelming terror, however, this natural multiplicity becomes a desperate survival strategy. Healing requires not the eradication of these inner factions, but a courageous exploration and eventual befriending of them. When human beings face profound humiliation or inescapable threat, they instinctively channel all their vital energy into self-preservation. This defense takes many forms. Some suppress their emotional reality completely, others cultivate a seething internal rage to ward off vulnerability, and still others construct an impenetrable armor of professional success or perfectionism. Many behaviors that the medical establishment routinely pathologizes as discrete psychiatric psychiatric disorders, such as compulsive rituals, sudden panic, and various forms of self-harm, originally took root as brilliant, life-saving adaptations to unendurable environments. Viewing these ingrained survival mechanisms merely as permanent diseases severely limits the scope of recovery, often reducing treatment to a lifelong regimen of symptom management through medication. A far more compassionate and accurate perspective recognizes that a survivor's hostility, numbing, or depression is a learned defense. At some critical juncture, the individual's nervous system concluded that survival depended on becoming invisible, highly aggressive, or entirely emotionally vacant. These traumatic adaptations stubbornly persist long after the original danger has vanished, continuing to dictate behavior until the organism can achieve a visceral sense of safety and integrate the fragmented aspects of the self that remain locked in perpetual combat. Surviving catastrophic environments requires an astronomical expenditure of psychological energy, and the toll it takes is immense. Children trapped in abusive homes often find it safer to internalize the hatred directed at them than to risk further alienation by protesting. They survive by fracturing their reality, banishing the memory of the violation, numbing their physical forms, and carrying a frozen, deeply hidden conviction of their own inherent worthlessness. In adulthood, this fragmentation continues to operate behind the scenes. A person might function with exceptional competence in the workplace, utilizing a highly protective, organized facet of their personality, yet find themselves suddenly paralyzed by terror or consumed by irrational rage in the context of physical intimacy. Unbeknownst to their conscious mind, a vulnerable, traumatized segment of their psyche perceives surrender as an immediate threat to survival, prompting another, highly aggressive segment to hijack their behavior to create a diversion. True recovery necessitates reconfiguring this complex internal architecture, shifting a system designed to anticipate the worst into one capable of resting securely in the present. The concept of the mind as a singular, unified entity is largely an illusion. Every individual operates as a mosaic of shifting states and distinct ways of being. In one moment, a person might be driven by an intense desire for solitary rest, while an hour later, a playful, adventurous spirit takes the helm. We all possess angry, generous, frightened, and highly critical facets, each emerging with its own characteristic vocabulary, physical posture, and set of priorities. Over the past century, brilliant thinkers across the spectrum of psychology and neuroscience have concluded that the human psyche functions much like a complex, self-regulating society. The mind is a congress of semi-autonomous modules, each tasked with a specific role in managing our existence. The quality of a person's life depends heavily on the quality of their internal leadership, the ability to listen to these diverse inner voices, ensure their needs are met, and prevent them from destroying one another. This profound understanding of internal multiplicity has been crystallized into therapeutic models that view the mind as an internal family. When trauma strikes, this internal family system fractures. The parts of the self that are the most sensitive, joyful, and innocent absorb the brunt of the abuse. To protect the overall organism from the unbearable agony, terror, and shame held by these vulnerable parts, they are locked away deep within the unconscious. They become exiles. As these exiles are banished, other parts of the personality are forced to adopt extreme roles to prevent the toxic pain from breaching the surface. Certain parts become rigid managers, adopting perfectionist, highly critical, or emotionally detached strategies to maintain absolute control over the individual's environment and relationships, ensuring that no one ever gets close enough to trigger the hidden wounds. Simultaneously, another class of protectors emerges as emergency responders. If an interaction inadvertently touches an exiled memory, these firefighters erupt into action, utilizing extreme, often destructive measures, such as substance abuse, reckless sexual encounters, or self-mutilation, to instantly extinguish the agonizing emotional flare-up. Every split-off part, no matter how destructive its outward behavior, was forged with a singular noble intention: to protect the core self from complete annihilation. The tragedy of the traumatized mind is the consistent absence of harmonious internal leadership. The system operates under the tyranny of outdated survival rules, perpetually reacting to historical threats. When a protective part or a terrified exile completely takes over the conscious mind, a phenomenon known as blending, the individual loses all perspective. as the re-establishment of a calm, mindful presence that can separate from these extreme states. Beneath the chaotic noise of the managers and the frantic actions of the firefighters lies an undamaged, uncorrupted essence. This core self does not need to be artificially constructed, it merely needs to be uncovered. When the fiercely protective parts can be persuaded that the immediate danger has passed, this innate self spontaneously emerges, bringing with it an inherent capacity for curiosity, compassion, and calm observation. The self acts as the conductor of the internal orchestra, acknowledging the vital contribution of every instrument while guiding the system toward a unified, harmonious existence. The therapeutic journey begins by carefully untangling the chaotic blend of emotions. Individuals are guided to notice the specific part of themselves that is currently generating distress, perhaps an overwhelming sense of worthlessness or a sudden urge to lash out. Rather than judging or attempting to banish this part, the individual is encouraged to step back and adopt a stance of gentle inquiry. By asking, "How do I feel toward this part of me right now?" the foundation for self-leadership is laid. If the answer is one of hatred or disgust, it indicates that yet another protective part has stepped in, attempting to manage the situation through harsh criticism. The individual must then ask this secondary critic to temporarily step aside, clearing the space for genuine, compassionate curiosity toward the originally distressed part. This painstaking process of unblending transforms a battlefield of conflicting impulses into a landscape of self-reflection, allowing the individual to initiate a constructive, internal dialogue with the very aspects of their psyche they previously feared most. Consider the trajectory of an individual whose life oscillates wildly between formidable professional competence, explosive rage, and profound self-loathing. Such chaotic fluctuations are the hallmarks of a system dominated by extreme protectors. In therapy, the objective is not to artificially suppress the rage or logically argue against the self-loathing, but to establish a safe container where the individual can observe these distinct parts in action. A highly aggressive, critical part might initially present itself as the enemy of therapeutic progress, actively attacking the individual's self-worth and questioning the safety of the therapeutic environment. However, when approached with genuine curiosity from the perspective of the calm self, the true motivation of this internal critic is revealed. It is a desperate manager, utilizing harsh internal attacks to preempt the devastating external criticism and abuse the individual endured in childhood. To navigate this intricate internal world, one must first befriend the managers. These are the parts that dictate the terms of daily survival. They control the emotional thermostat, ensuring that vulnerability is kept firmly in check. They may present as a fiercely independent professional, a sexually reckless adolescent persona used to create a facade of intimacy while remaining entirely emotionally detached, or a rigid moralist. These managers carry exhausting burdens of responsibility and are almost always operating far beyond their capacity. It is crucial to recognize their incredible competence. These very same protective mechanisms often drive immense worldly success and meticulous caregiving in the external world. Yet their relentless vigilance leaves the internal system brittle. When external stress mounts, a poor performance review or a perceived rejection, the managers may double down on their harsh tactics, inadvertently driving the individual into deeper despair and isolation in their misguided attempt to maintain control. When the manager's defenses are breached and the agonizing vulnerability of the exiles begins to bleed into consciousness, the firefighters are deployed. The ensuing reaction is rarely subtle. If a therapeutic session touches too closely upon a terrifying childhood memory, the resulting surge of emotional pain triggers an immediate, drastic response. The individual may skip their next appointment, disappear into a binge of alcohol or food, or engage in high-risk behaviors. The firefighter's sole mandate is to numb, distract, or obliterate the emerging agony by any means necessary, regardless of the collateral damage to the individual's life or relationships. Unlike the managers who seek stability, the firefighters will gladly burn down the house to stop the emotional bleeding. This frantic cycle of triggering and extinguishing cannot be broken by sheer willpower or behavioral contracts. It ceases only when the deepest, most agonizing wounds, the exiles themselves, are safely retrieved and healed. The exiles carry the raw, unadulterated horror of the past. They hold the absolute conviction of impending annihilation, the crushing physical weight of helplessness, and the toxic shame instilled by abuses. rest of the internal system, these exiles are perceived as lethal radioactive waste. When they breach the surface, they threaten to drag the entire organism back into the abyss of the original trauma. Yet the tragic cost of keeping these parts locked in the dark is the simultaneous imprisonment of the individual's most vital, creative, and joyful capacities. The child who was banished for being too vulnerable is also the child who knows how to play, to trust, and to experience uninhibited love. Condemning the wounded parts to eternal isolation ensures that the survivor's world remains devoid of genuine intimacy and authentic vitality. The culmination of this profound internal work is the courageous retrieval of the exiles. From the secure, compassionate vantage point of the self, the individual is guided to revisit the frozen landscapes of their past. They approach the terrified, isolated child they once were, offering the exact protection, understanding, and strength that was brutally absent during the original trauma. The survivor does not merely observe the memory, they actively intervene in their own internal history, rescuing the exiled part and bringing it into the safety of the present moment. This act of internal rescue fundamentally alters the neural encoding of the trauma. Helpless paralysis is replaced by active, self-led mastery. As the internal system achieves harmony, the external world begins to transform. The energy previously consumed by internal warfare becomes available for genuine connection. When individuals learn to observe their own parts with compassion, they gain the capacity to recognize the frantic protectors and wounded exiles operating within their partners and loved ones. A relationship previously defined by mutual triggering and defensive withdrawal can evolve into a space of profound mutual mentoring, where the legacy of trauma is steadily dismantled by the unifying, healing power of mindful self-leadership. Chapter 18. Filling in the holes. Creating structures. Human development relies on a predictable, continuous sequence of nurturing experiences. To build a cohesive sense of self, a growing child requires the steady accumulation of physical safety, emotional attunement, and reliable protection. When profound trauma or chronic neglect interrupts this vital sequence, it does not merely inflict a wound, it leaves vast, invisible voids in the very architecture of the developing mind. These absences are not merely psychological deficits or forgotten memories, they are deeply physiological. The nervous system literally lacks the somatic blueprint of what it feels like to be securely held, to be shielded from imminent danger, or to be looked upon with unconditional delight. Traditional conversational therapies frequently falter when attempting to address these specific voids, simply because it is impossible to talk an individual into feeling a physical sensation of safety that they have never historically experienced. To heal a body that has organized itself entirely around the expectation of threat, the nervous system must be provided with a visceral, embodied experience of the sanctuary it was denied. This profound biological necessity gave rise to an extraordinary therapeutic approach that merges the emotional depth of traditional analysis with the spatial and physical dynamics of theater. In this highly specialized modality, the journey of healing is not confined to the static environment of a chair or a couch. Instead, the individual is invited to physically construct the internal, often chaotic landscape of their mind within a three-dimensional room, utilizing the physical presence of other group members. This meticulous, deeply deliberate process is known as creating a structure. It is the active, physical staging of the individual's deepest unmet needs and historical traumas, transforming a lifetime of silent, isolated agony into a shared, undeniable physical reality. The transformative power of this method lies in its sophisticated utilization of physical space and bodily positioning. When an individual, the protagonist of the structure, begins to touch upon a terrifying or deeply desolate memory, their physical body instinctively assumes the defensive posture of that historical moment. Their shoulders may severely cave in, their breathing often becomes shallow and rapid, and their eyes may avert to avoid an unseen, anticipated blow. In a conventional therapeutic setting, this somatic collapse might simply be observed or discussed. However, within the active space of a structure, the protagonist is gently but firmly encouraged to design a radical physical alternative to their history. They are asked to survey the room and select members of the group to step in as ideal figures, an ideal mother, an ideal father, or a fierce fiercely protective guardian. These ideal figures are not intended to represent the protagonist's actual, flawed parents, nor are they asked to perform a scripted role. Their purpose is far more profound. They provide the exact, specific energetic and physical presence that the protagonist originally required to remain safe and whole. If the foundational trauma involved a violent or volatile caregiver, the protagonist might position a strong, securely grounded group member squarely between themselves and the imagined historical threat. The protagonist explicitly instructs this ideal protector to stand firm, to hold the line, and to shield them from the incoming danger. When the protagonist physically sees this protective barrier and tangibly feels the safety radiating from this ideal figure, a miraculous biological shift occurs. The primitive, emotional regions of the brain, which do not strictly differentiate between a deeply imagined, physically enacted scenario and historical reality, suddenly receive a massive influx of novel, contradictory sensory data. For the first time in their life, the survivor's nervous system registers the visceral, undeniable physical sensation of being successfully defended and entirely secure. Daring to tell the truth. The most agonizing, formidable barrier to this profound physical and emotional restructuring is the staggering weight of childhood denial. For a young, developing mind, the biological imperative to maintain a life-sustaining attachment to a caregiver is absolute. It aggressively supersedes all other instincts, even the primal instinct to avoid physical pain. To survive an environment governed by abusive, terrifying, or severely neglectful parents, a child is forced to execute a desperate, heartbreaking psychological maneuver. They must absorb the entirety of the blame. They inevitably convince themselves that they are inherently flawed, toxic, and fundamentally unlovable. They adopt this crushing burden because the alternative, acknowledging the terrifying reality that the all-powerful gods of their universe are malevolent, broken, or entirely incompetent, is a terror far too vast for a child to endure. This tragically distorted worldview hardens over the decades, calcifying into an unshakable somatic conviction of personal badness that fiercely resists any rational attempt at therapeutic dismantling. Therefore, the process of shattering this lifelong armor requires an act of immense, almost unfathomable courage. It demands daring to tell the absolute, unvarnished truth. Within the meticulously secured physical space of the therapeutic structure, the individual is gently, persistently guided to vocalize the unspeakable realities of their history. This is never a detached intellectual recounting of facts or a chronological summary of events. It is the raw, agonizing expulsion of the grief, the furious, impotent rage, and the profound sorrow that has been locked in the musculature of the body for a lifetime. The protagonist must look directly at the reality of their abandonment, their violation, or their terror, and name it precisely for what it was. They must lay the blame and the responsibility squarely where it historically belongs, stripping away the decades of protective self-hatred. When this terrifying truth is finally dragged into the light and spoken aloud, the architecture of the structure provides its most vital, life-altering function: compassionate, unwavering witnessing. In the outside world, expressing the raw, unadulterated agony of severe trauma frequently causes listeners to recoil in horror, to offer hollow, minimizing platitudes, or to attempt to rush the survivor toward a premature, artificial forgiveness. But in this designated sacred space, the ideal figures and the observing group members do not flinch. They hold the physical and emotional space with absolute stillness, absorbing the full, devastating impact of the protagonist's despair without crumbling, without retaliating, and without withdrawing their presence. This communal, physical witnessing is biologically revolutionary. As the truth is spoken and safely physically received by the group, the deeply ingrained, lifelong conviction of inherent toxicity begins to fracture. The protagonist experiences, in the very marrow of their bones, that their deepest pain does not destroy the world, and that their most closely guarded shame does not render them unlovable. By physically inhabiting the presence of the ideal caregivers and allowing themselves to be held or protected in the structure, they absorb the gaze of unconditional acceptance and love that was historically withheld. The developmental holes of their past are not erased, for history cannot be rewritten, but those agonizing voids are finally filled with a new, overwhelmingly powerful somatic memory of sanctuary, connection, and undeniable worth. The nervous system, which had remained frozen for decades in the posture of a terrified, is finally permitted to stand upright, fully inhabiting the present moment with a reclaimed sense of strength, belonging, and profound internal peace. Chapter 19. Rewiring the Brain. Neurofeedback. Beneath the protective casing of the human skull lies an astonishingly intricate, endlessly dynamic electrical universe. The brain is not merely a collection of anatomical structures bathed in a chemical soup. It is fundamentally an organ of profound electrical resonance. Every thought we harbor, every emotion that washes over us, and every physical movement we execute is orchestrated by the synchronized firing of billions of neurons. When these neurons communicate, they generate rhythmic pulses of electrical energy known as brainwaves. These waves oscillate at varying frequencies, dictating our state of consciousness with absolute precision. In a healthy, resilient nervous system, the brain shifts seamlessly through these frequencies, much like a skilled driver smoothly navigating the gears of a complex vehicle. When deep rest is required, the brain generates the slow, rolling rhythms of delta waves. During moments of relaxed reflection or meditation, it hums with the steady cadence of alpha. When active, focused problem-solving is demanded, the frequency accelerates into the rapid firing of beta waves. However, the catastrophic impact of severe psychological trauma completely shatters this elegant internal symphony. The extreme survival responses initiated during a terrifying event leave an indelible mark, not just on the brain's chemical balance, but on its fundamental electrical circuitry. The traumatized brain frequently loses its vital elasticity, becoming agonizingly trapped in rigid, unyielding patterns of electrical firing. For many survivors, the fear circuitry remains locked in a state of relentless, high-frequency beta activity, causing them to exist in a permanent state of hyper-aroused terror, unable to power down even in the absolute safety of their own bedrooms. For others, the overwhelming nature of their abuse forces their nervous system into a chronic state of biological collapse, resulting in an excess of slow, sluggish theta waves that leave them perpetually fogged, profoundly dissociated, and unable to connect with the vibrant reality of the present moment. They are held hostage by their own neural rhythms, desperately trying to navigate the demands of daily life with an engine that is either permanently redlining or entirely flooded. The realization that trauma is fundamentally an electrical dysregulation opened the door to an astonishing non-invasive avenue of healing. With the advent of sophisticated quantitative electroencephalography, or QEEG, it became possible to map the precise electrical topography of a suffering mind. By placing sensors on a patient's scalp, clinicians can observe the brain's rhythmic firing in real time, instantly identifying the specific areas where the electrical frequencies are misfiring, stalled, or firing in chaotic, uncoordinated storms. This map provides a stark, undeniable visual representation of the survivor's invisible agony, validating their experience not as a psychological weakness, but as a tangible physiological reality. More profoundly, this technology gave rise to neurofeedback, a therapeutic modality that harnesses the brain's innate, miraculous capacity for neuroplasticity, its inherent desire to learn, adapt, and reorganize itself. Neurofeedback operates on a brilliantly simple premise, creating a closed-loop system where the brain can actually observe its own behavior. During a session, the electrical signals picked up from the patient's scalp are fed into a computer program. The patient simply sits before a screen and watches a movie or plays a simple video game that is entirely controlled by their own brainwaves. The computer is meticulously programmed to reward the specific healthy frequencies that the traumatized brain struggles to produce, while gently discouraging the chaotic, hyper-aroused, or dissociated frequencies that fuel their suffering. The process bypasses the conscious, rational mind entirely. The patient does not need to analyze their trauma, articulate their pain, or actively try to force themselves to relax. They simply watch the screen. When their brain spontaneously generates a calming alpha wave or successfully stabilizes an erratic beta wave, the computer instantly provides a reward. The movie plays brightly, or the video game advances. The moment the brain slips back into its habitual, traumatized pattern of chaotic firing, the screen darkens and the audio fades. The human brain is a fiercely adaptive organ, profoundly driven to seek patterns and attain rewards. Below the threshold of conscious awareness, the neural networks begin to make the connection. They recognize that producing specific rhythmic frequencies keeps the desired stimulus active. Through hundreds of these micro-adjustments within a single session, the brain slowly painstakingly trains itself to abandon its terrified, rigid pathways and forge new, stabilized circuits. It is akin to physical therapy for the central nervous system. Over the course of repeated sessions, the brain learns how to shift its own gears again. The relentless, high-frequency electrical storms that drive night terrors and explosive rage begin to subside. The heavy, sluggish waves of dissociation are gradually replaced by the alert, engaged frequencies of the present moment. By practicing this electrical self-regulation, the survivor fundamentally alters the underlying architecture of their own suffering, achieving a profound physiological calm that years of conversational therapy and heavy pharmacology often fail to provide. Neurofeedback, PTSD, and addiction. When a nervous system is locked in a state of perpetual, agonizing distress, the individual is faced with an unbearable reality. The internal landscape is so chaotic, the physical sensations of fear so crushing, and the emotional numbness so profound that mere existence requires an impossible expenditure of energy. In the desperate biological imperative to survive, the traumatized individual will inevitably seek out external methods to alter their intolerable internal state. It is within this agonizing context that the tragedy of severe addiction must be understood. Substance abuse is rarely a primary disease born of moral failing, weak character, or a simple pursuit of pleasure. It is, almost universally, a desperate, unconscious attempt to self-medicate a violently dysregulated brain. The substances that individuals are magnetically drawn to are rarely accidental. They are highly specific chemical interventions intended to forcefully modulate the brain's broken electrical rhythms. A survivor plagued by the relentless high-beta storms of chronic hypervigilance and terrifying intrusive memories will naturally gravitate towards central nervous system depressants. Alcohol and powerful opioids act as a chemical sledgehammer, forcefully suppressing the frantic electrical firing and providing a temporary, desperate reprieve from the internal panic. Conversely, an individual whose trauma has resulted in profound dissociation, trapped in the foggy, detached realm of excessive slow-wave activity, may seek out the sharp, piercing jolt of stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines. These substances artificially force the brain into higher frequencies, providing a fleeting, manufactured sensation of vitality, focus, and connection to the world. However, this chemical tyranny extracts a devastating toll. The brain, constantly bombarded by these external substances, gradually ceases its own desperate attempts to regulate itself. The internal neurochemical factories shut down, the addiction deepens, and the underlying trauma remains entirely unhealed, masked by the chaotic cycle of intoxication and agonizing withdrawal. Traditional addiction treatments often fail catastrophically because they focus exclusively on behavioral compliance and the removal of the substance, completely ignoring the terrifying, dysregulated neural landscape that made the substance absolutely necessary for survival in the first place. Stripping away the chemical shield without providing a biological alternative leaves the survivor completely defenseless against the raw, unmitigated horror of their traumatized nervous system, making relapse not just likely, but physiologically inevitable. Neurofeedback introduces a revolutionary disruption to this tragic cycle. By directly targeting the foundational electrical instability, it offers a purely biological solution to the craving. As the brain engages with the computer interface and slowly learns to generate its own calming alpha waves, or to stabilize its erratic beta activity, the profound driving necessity for external chemical regulation begins to evaporate. The individual is no longer forced to rely on a bottle or a needle to quiet the internal storm, because their own neural networks have learned how to accomplish the task. As the electrical architecture of the brain is painstakingly repaired, the agonizing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, the insomnia, the hyperreactivity, the terrifying flashbacks gradually lose their power. The mind becomes a safe place to inhabit once more. Freed from the exhausting, desperate labor of managing their own dysregulation, the survivor finally possesses the mental clarity and physiological stability required to engage in the deeper relational work of true, lasting recovery, dismantling the addiction by rendering it entirely obsolete. Chapter 20. Finding Your Voice, Communal Rhythms and Theatre. To endure severe trauma is to be subjected to an agonizing silencing. The sheer magnitude of the horror overwhelms the brain's capacity to translate experience into spoken effectively shutting down the neural centers responsible for articulation. The survivor is left isolated within a fortress of unspoken terror, unable to communicate the depth of their despair and entirely severed from the comforting resonance of human connection. This profound voicelessness extends far beyond the inability to recount the specific details of the past. It permeates the entirety of the individual's existence. The physical body, burdened by the heavy residue of shame and fear, instinctively shrinks. The chest collapses to protect the vital organs. The breath becomes shallow and rapid, and the voice loses its natural timbre, reduced to a tentative, barely audible whisper or a harsh, defensive rasp. The individual forgets how to take up space in the world, how to project their presence, and how to engage in the fundamental reciprocal rhythms of social interaction. For decades, the standard clinical approach to this profound mutism was to persistently urge the survivor to simply push through the silence, to force the traumatized self to recount the agonizing history in a sterile, clinical environment. Yet this approach frequently ignores the biological reality that the traumatized brain is actively blocking the pathways to speech. A far more compassionate and effective path to reclaiming the lost voice frequently bypasses the direct confrontation of the trauma altogether, utilizing instead the ancient, universal power of collective rhythm and theatrical expression. Long before the advent of modern psychotherapy, human communities instinctively relied on shared rhythmic practices to metabolize grief, celebrate triumphs, and restore communal harmony. The coordinated pounding of drums, the synchronized movements of traditional dances, and the resonant harmonies of choral singing are not mere cultural artifacts. They are sophisticated neurobiological interventions that directly engage the lowest, most primitive regions of the brainstem, overriding the chaotic alarms of the traumatized nervous system. When an individual whose internal rhythms have been shattered by terror engages in a synchronized physical activity with others, a miraculous biological recalibration begins. Engaging in a communal drum circle or a group physical warm-up demands a continuous, sustained focus on the present moment. The individual must listen to the cadence of the group and physically align their own movements and breath with that shared pulse. This synchronization forcefully disrupts the isolating, erratic physiological storms of post-traumatic stress. As the group moves and sounds as one, the social engagement system, governed by the ventral vagus nerve, is profoundly stimulated. The survivor experiences a visceral, embodied sensation of belonging. They are no longer a solitary, broken fragment fighting for survival. They are a vital, integrated component of a larger, cohesive organism. This experience of safe, predictable connection provides the essential foundation necessary for the individual to eventually risk stepping out of their silence. Building upon this rhythmic foundation, the structured environment of the theater offers a uniquely powerful sanctuary for those attempting to reclaim their capacity for expression. For a severely traumatized youth or an adult survivor of chronic abuse, the prospect of expressing their own genuine, vulnerable emotions is fraught with the terrifying expectation of retaliation or profound rejection. The genius of theatrical work lies in its provision of a robust protective shield, the character. When an individual steps onto a stage and assumes a role, they are granted permission to inhabit a different reality. They can safely express towering rage, profound sorrow, or commanding authority without the paralyzing fear of real-world consequences, because the emotions belong ostensibly to the character rather than the self. The script provides a safe, predictable structure, eliminating the terrifying uncertainty of spontaneous conversation. The words are already written. The actor's task is to breathe life into them. This process of inhabiting a character requires a profound physical and emotional mobilization that stands in direct opposition to the collapsed posture of trauma. To deliver a line effectively, the actor must plant their feet firmly on the ground, establishing a secure, grounded connection to the earth. They must draw a deep, sustained breath, fully expanding the very chest cavity they have spent years unconsciously shielding. They must project their voice with volume and resonance, demanding to be heard and asserting their undeniable presence in the physical space. Furthermore, theater is an inherently collaborative endeavor. The actor must look directly into the eyes of their scene partners, intuitively reading their subtle facial expressions and responding with genuine, in-the-moment presence. This intense, coordinated mirroring is the exact so ruthlessly destroys. The transformative impact of this work is starkly evident in programs that bring the demanding rigor of classical theatre, particularly the works of Shakespeare, to marginalized or deeply traumatized populations, such as incarcerated youth. These adolescents, who have frequently been labeled by society as irredeemable delinquents and who possess internal landscapes defined by violence and profound neglect, are challenged to master complex, archaic language and inhabit characters of immense power and emotional depth. Initially, the resistance is immense. The physical vulnerability of standing on a stage and the cognitive demand of memorizing lines trigger their deeply ingrained defensive managers. Yet, as the rigorous rehearsal process unfolds, driven by a director who serves as a safe, uncompromising, and deeply attentive authority figure, the armor begins to crack. The adolescents discover that the explosive, chaotic energy that previously fueled their destructive behaviors can be channeled and mastered. They learn the agonizingly difficult skill of tolerating the frustration of a missed cue or a forgotten line without instantly devolving into violent rage or profound withdrawal. They experience the profound, often unfamiliar sensation of relying entirely on another human being, their fellow cast members, to keep the scene alive. The script becomes a container vast enough to hold the immense magnitude of their unexpressed suffering. When a young man who has endured systemic abuse and societal abandonment stands center stage and delivers a soliloquy demanding justice or expressing ultimate despair, he is not merely reciting a play. He is utilizing the genius of a playwright to finally grant an articulate, commanding voice to his own buried agony. The culmination of this therapeutic journey is the performance itself, which fundamentally rewrites the dynamic of the survivor's trauma. In the original traumatic event, the individual was rendered entirely helpless, often subjected to the horrifying gaze of a perpetrator, while the rest of the world remained agonizingly absent or indifferent. The theatrical performance reverses this paradigm. The survivor intentionally steps into the light, possessing total agency over their movements and their voice. They actively present their truth, channeled through their character, to an assembled audience. The audience, in turn, serves the vital role of the compassionate witness. They do not turn away from the